The morning sun sliced through the windshield as Tanya Carter's aging Honda rolled into the parking lot of Crestwood High. The engine sputtered slightly as she turned the key, and Jamal Carter, sitting in the passenger seat, adjusted the red harness on Shadow, his emotional support dog. The German Shepherd mix gave a short, quiet whine, not out of distress, but as if he could sense what was coming. "Big day," Tanya said, forcing a smile. "You ready?" Jamal nodded once. His eyes were fixed on the building ahead. A new school. New people. New stairs. But the same weight on his chest. He'd moved often over the years, ever since that night, 3 years ago, when his father was taken from him in the kind of news story that gets 30 seconds on the 11 o'clock news, but leaves a family broken forever. Since then, PTSD had wrapped itself around his life like an invisible chain, tightening at the sound of sirens, the sight of flashing lights, or the slightest unexpected movement. Shadow, trained specifically for him, had changed that. With the dog at his side, the world didn't feel like a battlefield anymore. Just something he could walk through, step by step. Tanya reached over and touched his arm gently. "You've got this. Just breathe. Let them see you. The real you." Jamal opened the door, and Shadow stepped out first, tail low but confident. Together, they crossed the parking lot, one quiet unit. No barking, no pulling, just presence. They had made it as far as the front steps when it started. "Excuse me, hey. You can't bring a dog in here." The voice came from a sharp-looking woman standing near the entrance, clipboard in hand and scowl on her face. Her ID badge swung slightly, Deborah Holloway, assistant principal. Jamal stopped, calmly pulling a folded letter from his backpack. He'd been prepared for this. His therapist had told him to be proactive. The district office had approved Shadow. Everything was in writing. "He's a registered emotional support dog." "I've got paperwork," Jamal said, offering the letter with a quiet confidence. She took it, skimmed it for all of 3 seconds, and handed it back like it was contaminated. "I don't care what your therapist says," she replied curtly. "School policy is no animals on campus." A few nearby students had slowed their steps, listening. Jamal could feel their eyes, not just curious, but judging. Shadow, as if reading his body language, leaned closer to his leg. "He's not a pet," Jamal said, his voice more firm now. "He's prescribed. I have PTSD. I went through the district. You should have a copy of the approval." Assistant Principal Holloway crossed her arms. "Well, I haven't seen it. And until I get official confirmation, that dog doesn't come inside. You can wait in the office until we sort it out, or you can leave. Your choice." Jamal stood still. Everything inside him screamed to stay calm, to not cause a scene. That's what his mother had always told him: don't give them a reason to say you're angry. Don't give them an excuse. But he wasn't angry. He was tired. Tired of being treated like he didn't belong. Tired of having to explain his trauma to people who didn't want to listen. Tired of being black and being doubted, even when he did everything right. He looked at her squarely. "This is discrimination. And it's illegal." The words weren't shouted, but they landed like a slap. A few students froze. Someone pulled out their phone. Jamal saw the screen light up, recording. The air changed. Holloway's mouth tightened. "You can take that attitude elsewhere," she snapped. "But you're not going into class with that animal." Final word. More students were gathering now, whispering. One kid, maybe a junior, muttered, "That's messed up," under his breath. Another nodded. But no one stepped forward. Jamal bent down and whispered to Shadow, who looked up at him with calm, intelligent eyes. Then he stood back up and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "I'm not going to sit in a corner and be quiet while someone decides whether or not my disability is valid." And then, just like that, he turned and walked, not toward the office, not back to the car, but to the grass by the school flagpole, where he sat down cross-legged on the lawn. Shadow curled beside him, head resting on Jamal's knee. Students started filming. A few sat nearby in quiet solidarity. No signs. No chance. Just presence. Inside, Holloway was already making calls. 30 minutes later, Tanya Carter stood in the main office, her eyes blazing. "You told my son he couldn't enter the building with a registered emotional support animal, after the district approved it," she said, holding the official email on her phone. "You told him to leave or wait. You made my son sit outside with the dog who literally keeps him from reliving his father's death." Principal Emerson, a balding man in his 60s with a tired expression, tried to calm her. "We'll look into it, ma'am. It's just a misunderstanding." "No, it's not," she said, cutting him off. "It's a pattern." Outside, the quiet protest continued. Students trickled out during breaks. Some brought water. One girl, shy and soft-spoken, handed Jamal a granola bar without saying a word. The video clips hit social media before noon. One TikTok caption read, "New kid not allowed inside 'cause of his support dog. TF." Another simply said, "When black kids ask for help, this is what happens." By 3 p.m., Jamal and Shadow were trending in the state. By dinnertime, a local news crew had parked their van across the street. At home, Tanya's phone rang non-stop. Civil rights organizations. Education lawyers. Reporters. Former students. And through it all, Jamal sat silently on the living room couch, Shadow nestled beside him, breathing steady and soft. His mom came and sat beside him. "I'm proud of you," she said, wrapping an arm around his shoulders. "I didn't want to be a story," he whispered. "Too late for that," she said, her voice full of both sorrow and steel. "But maybe it's the story someone else needs to hear." Jamal looked down at Shadow. "We didn't even make it to first period," he muttered. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of his voice. Jamal smiled faintly. "Guess we made an impression." Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The night Jamal Carter stopped sleeping was the night his father never came home. He was 14 then, sitting on the edge of the living room couch with a controller in his hand, pretending to focus on a video game while his mom reheated leftovers in the kitchen. His dad, Marcus, was supposed to be back by 8. It was nearly 10. Jamal remembered every clock tick, every flicker of the screen, the way the shadows stretched across the hallway as if the house itself was holding its breath. The knock at the door was quiet, too quiet. Tanya opened it halfway and stood frozen. There were 2 officers in uniform, one black, one white. Neither looked her in the eye. The words came like broken glass, "We're sorry." There was an altercation. "Your husband, he didn't survive." Jamal didn't cry that night. Not really. He just sat there, hands numb, controller slipping to the floor. In the weeks that followed, he learned how silence could scream and how grief could settle into walls, into skin, into breath. The details came later, how a simple traffic stop had turned violent, how someone claimed Marcus had reached for something, how there was no body cam footage. There was an internal investigation, but nothing ever came of it. Nothing ever does. At the funeral, people called Marcus a good man. A provider. A gentle soul. Jamal believed them because he had lived it. His father had been the kind of man who taught him how to change a tire, how to apologize when you were wrong, and how to stand up even when you were afraid. His laugh could fill a room. His hug could make the world stop hurting, for a while. After the funeral, Jamal started waking up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, drenched in sweat. Sometimes he thought he heard sirens. Sometimes he swore he saw lights flashing through the window, even though no one was outside. He stopped sleeping. He stopped talking. At school, he drifted through the days like a ghost. Some teachers noticed. Most didn't. Tanya tried everything. Therapists, counselors, even church. But nothing stuck. It wasn't until a volunteer at a local trauma recovery center suggested a service animal that something shifted. Shadow wasn't his name at first. He'd been rescued from a kill shelter, thin, skittish, but smart. The trainer said the bond would take time. But from the moment Jamal held out his hand and the dog touched it with his nose, something clicked. Not like magic. More like recognition. Like two survivors saying, "You too." Jamal named him Shadow because that's exactly what he became. A presence that followed, that steadied, that warned him when things inside started breaking down. The first time Jamal had a panic attack in public, Shadow nudged his leg, pawed gently at his chest, and laid his head in Jamal's lap until the world slowed back into place. The change wasn't instant. Healing never is. But over time, Jamal began to breathe differently. To sleep, sometimes. To speak without his throat closing up. He learned how to manage the triggers, flashing lights, loud shouting, sudden movement, and Shadow learned how to spot them before he did. Their bond was unspoken, powerful, and absolute. The kind that doesn't ask questions or require explanations. When Jamal started at Crestwood High, it was supposed to be a fresh start. Tanya had moved them across town to a safer neighborhood with a better school district. She took on a third shift at the hospital just to afford the rent. Jamal knew what it cost her, every hour spent on her feet instead of sleeping. But she did it anyway, because she believed in him. Before school started, Tanya had followed every protocol. She called the district. Submitted the documents. Sent Shadow's medical and behavioral records. She was told everything was approved. No issues. "You're all set," they said. But words like that meant little to Jamal now. He'd learned early that following the rules didn't protect people like him. You could have all your papers in order, speak respectfully, follow every procedure, and still be told no. Still be labeled as difficult, dramatic, or dangerous. He remembered one therapist who'd looked at him with sympathy and said, "You're very composed for someone your age." As if his restraint were a surprise. As if his silence were a victory, not a wound. Jamal had stopped trying to be understood a long time ago. He just wanted space to exist. To learn. To survive. That's all. But the moment Assistant Principal Holloway had looked down at him, not his documents, not his voice, not his trauma, but him, and dismissed his need, it all came rushing back. The judgment. The disbelief. The accusation without words, "You're lying. You're manipulating. You're just looking for attention." He saw the same look in Holloway's face that he'd seen in the officer's eyes the night they told his mother Marcus was dead. A look that said, "You don't matter here." And still, he'd stood his ground. Because even when the world pushed him to the edge, Shadow pulled him back. That evening, as he sat on his bed with Shadow curled beside him, Jamal opened his notebook. He hadn't written in a while, but tonight felt different. He scribbled a few lines. "They say speak up. But when you do, they mute you with policy. You show them the papers. They show you the door. You bring the proof. They say it's not enough." He paused, tapped the pen against the page, then wrote. "But I'm not leaving this time. My voice is not negotiable. And this Shadow? He stays too." Shadow stirred at the sound of Jamal's voice, tail thumping gently. Jamal smiled, just slightly, and scratched behind the dog's ears. Down the hall, Tanya was still on the phone. He heard snippets, words like civil rights, board complaint, media inquiry. She was building something. A case. A shield. A fight. But Jamal knew this fight wasn't just hers. It was his. And as much as he wanted to disappear, to dissolve into the background like he always had before, something deeper had awakened inside him. Not anger. Not even defiance. Resolve. He didn't want to be a symbol. He didn't want to go viral or become anyone's cause. He just wanted what every student wanted, the right to be seen, to be heard, to learn in peace, and to heal without asking for permission. And if that meant stepping into the light with his shadow at his side, so be it. The next morning, Jamal walked through the gates of Crestwood High again, shadow at his side, and the entire campus seemed to pause. Conversations quieted, heads turned, and eyes followed him like he was the subject of a breaking news story, which, in fact, he was. Overnight, the video of his confrontation had blown up across social media. By breakfast, it had hit over 1.2 million views. People reposted it with hashtags like #LetShadowIn and #SupportJamal. Some framed it as a civil rights issue, others as a failure of the school system. But Jamal didn't care about the clicks or the comments. He cared about breathing through each step, staying focused, and not letting his anxiety choke him in the hallways now buzzing with curiosity. He kept his eyes forward, but the murmurs reached him anyway. Is that the kid from the video? Yo, that's him. The one with the dog. Crazy. I didn't know PTSD was real like that for people our age. But not every whisper was sympathetic. That's just drama. Who brings a dog to school for attention? I bet he faked all that paperwork. Bet it's not even a real thing. Jamal heard every word, even if no one said it to his face. That was the thing about being different, you learned to read between the lines, to absorb every tone and side glance like punches you weren't allowed to block. He found his way to his locker, tried not to notice the girl filming him across the hall, or the jock in a Letterman jacket who snorted and muttered something about special treatment. Shadow stayed close, sensing the tightness in Jamal's shoulders. The dog's body leaned gently into his leg, just enough to say, I'm here. It was in that moment, as Jamal was trying to breathe through it all, that a voice cut through the noise, clear, warm, unexpected. You need someone to walk with? He turned to see a tall girl with honey-brown skin, thick braids, and a calm kind of confidence that didn't try too hard. She wore jeans, a hoodie with a Young Poets Society logo, and a messenger bag that was covered in pins about mental health and activism. I'm Aaliyah, she said. Saw the video. You good? Jamal blinked. For a second, he didn't know what to say. Most people either stared or avoided him now. No one had spoken to him like that, normal, direct, and human. Yeah. I mean, trying to be, he said. Well, you're not alone, okay, she replied. My little brother has an emotional support cat. Whole school tried to kick it out of the dorms last year. It's wild how fast people act like compassion is optional. He smiled, just a little. Thanks. Aaliyah glanced down at Shadow. He's beautiful. What's his name? Shadow. Figures. He's like your quiet superhero. Jamal gave a soft laugh. Shadow's tail thumped once. From that moment, something shifted. Aaliyah walked with him to their shared English class. She sat next to him. She introduced him to two of her friends, Luis, who ran the AV club, and May, a journalism student with sharp eyes and a sharper pen. Within hours, they had begun sketching plans, talk to teachers, collect signatures, write a petition. The beginning of a student-led pushback. But not everyone was ready to rally. At lunch, Jamal sat with Aaliyah's group near the courtyard. A few other students joined them, some curious, others supportive. A boy with headphones offered him a granola bar. A girl with a sketchpad asked if she could draw Shadow. And then came the interruption. A tray slammed onto the table beside them, followed by a scoff. This seat taken, or is this where all the rule breakers gather? The voice belonged to Brian Calloway, varsity football captain, class treasurer, and exactly the kind of student the administration adored. He was flanked by two teammates and wore the Crestwood jacket like a badge of inherited privilege. Jamal looked up, met his eyes. "Something you want, man?" Brian shrugged. "Just wondering what makes you so special. Everyone else follows the rules. You show up with a dog, throw a fit, and suddenly you're famous." Aaliyah cut in. "He followed every procedure. The district approved it." Brian laughed without humor. "Sure. But now all anyone talks about is him. The school's in chaos. People getting pulled from class, the media camping out front. Maybe some of us just want to graduate in peace." Jamal clenched his jaw. Shadow shifted beside him, sensing the tension. Louise stood up. "If you want peace, maybe try not bullying people with actual medical conditions." Brian's smirk widened. "Oh, so now I'm a bully? For asking questions?" "No," Jamal said, voice steady. "You're a bully for thinking my pain is less important than your comfort." Brian stared at him, and for a second, Jamal thought he might throw a punch. But then he scoffed again and walked away. The moment passed, but the unease remained. Conflict was no longer just between Jamal and the administration. It was bleeding into classrooms, friend groups, lunch tables. That afternoon, Jamal met with Ms. Thornton, the school counselor. She was younger than most teachers, with kind eyes and a cluttered office full of plants. "I just wanted to check in," she said gently. "How are you doing with everything?" Jamal hesitated. "Honestly? I don't know." She nodded. "That's fair." He expected a lecture. Instead, she reached into her drawer and handed him a notebook. It was blank, except for one page where she had written a quote, "The wound is the place where the light enters you." Rumi. "I don't have all the answers," she said, "but I do know that your voice matters. And this notebook's for when the world gets too loud." Jamal took it slowly. "Thanks." When he stepped out of the office, Aaliyah was waiting by the lockers. "You still in?" she asked. "In. We're printing flyers. Petition goes live tomorrow. May's writing an op-ed for the school paper." Jamal looked around the hall, the same hall where he'd once felt completely alone, and nodded. "Yeah. I'm in." And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel like he was walking into battle alone. The first day the flyers went up, Jamal felt the weight of the world shift. It wasn't just the petition that flooded the halls, it was the look in people's eyes. The whispers that had begun the day before were now replaced with open stares, some supportive, others, not so much. But one thing was certain, Jamal wasn't invisible anymore. It all started in the morning, when Aaliyah handed out the first stack of flyers before the bell rang. Louise had coordinated with the graphic design club to make a simple, bold statement: every student deserves a safe learning environment. Sign for Shadow. The flyers were everywhere, on lockers, on bulletin boards, on bathroom doors. It felt like the walls of Crestwood were speaking for the first time in years. Jamal stood by his locker, his hand resting on Shadow's head, feeling the tension begin to build inside him. The dog's steady breathing was the only thing keeping him grounded. He could hear it, the quiet murmurs, the hushed voices of students as they passed the flyers, their eyes shifting from him to the paper, then to each other. "Did you hear about the dog? That kid's got some nerve. He's not even sick, is he?" The comments stung, but they weren't new. Jamal had grown used to people questioning his trauma. To them, his pain wasn't visible enough, not dramatic enough, not loud enough. But this time, he wasn't going to shrink. This time, they would hear him. In first period, Jamal sat at the back of the classroom, Shadow under the desk. As Ms. Parker started the lesson, Jamal felt the eyes of his classmates on him, some curious, some judgmental, and a few, surprisingly, supportive. Aaliyah took the seat next to him, sliding him a piece of paper with a handwritten note, "We got this. Let them see we're not backing down." Jamal nodded, feeling a small flame of hope flicker inside him. But it was quickly extinguished when Principal Holloway entered the classroom during second period. "I need to speak to Jamal Carter," she said, her voice firm, her eyes scanning the room. The students fell silent. Jamal's heart dropped. He had been expecting this. It had been too quiet for too long. He stood, feeling the weight of every single pair of eyes on him, then followed Principal Holloway out into the hallway. Shadow, sensing the change, walked beside him, his tail low, his ears perked. "I've been made aware of the flyers, Jamal," Holloway began, her tone cold. "And the petition. I need to remind you that this school has policies in place for emotional support animals. Shadow doesn't meet the criteria." Jamal swallowed hard, trying to steady his voice. "I followed every procedure. My mom sent in all the paperwork. The district approved it. I'm not breaking any rules." Holloway didn't flinch. "I understand that. But we have to consider the bigger picture. Bringing an animal into a classroom affects the entire school environment. What about students with allergies? Or those who are afraid of dogs?" Jamal took a deep breath. "What about students with mental health needs? Who's looking out for us?" Holloway paused, as if weighing his words. "This isn't personal, Jamal. But we have to think about the school's reputation and the well-being of all students." "It is personal," Jamal shot back, his voice rising without him even realizing it. "You don't get to decide who gets to feel safe in this school. You don't get to decide whose needs matter." Principal Holloway's face hardened, but she didn't argue. Instead, she placed a hand on his shoulder, her grip tight and controlling. "I suggest you remove the flyers and retract the petition. Otherwise, we'll have to escalate this further." Jamal felt the fury rising in him. Everything inside him wanted to shout, to fight, to demand answers. But he remembered what Aaliyah had told him, "Don't lose your cool. The world is watching now." "Fine," he said, his voice steady but laced with anger. "But you're not stopping me. Shadow stays. And I'm not backing down." Principal Holloway's eyes narrowed, but she didn't respond. Instead, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking against the floor, leaving Jamal standing there, heart pounding, feeling like the walls were closing in. When he returned to class, the whispers had gotten louder, and so had the pressure. Aaliyah caught his eye and raised her eyebrows, a silent question. He nodded once, his fists clenched. "We're not giving up." The next few hours were a blur. Jamal barely heard the lessons, barely saw the chalk on the board. His mind kept returning to Principal Holloway's ultimatum. She wanted him to fold. She wanted to shut him down. But he couldn't let that happen. Not now. Not after everything. As the final bell rang and the students flooded out of the building, Jamal headed straight for the student parking lot, Shadow trotting beside him. His phone buzzed in his pocket. He pulled it out to see a message from Luis, "It's time. We're going public." The message was accompanied by a link to a live stream. Jamal opened it, and his stomach sank. Aaliyah, Luis, May, and several other students were standing outside the school, holding up signs and chanting. "Let Shadow in," they shouted. "Let students heal." It was a flashpoint. The beginning of something bigger than Jamal had ever expected. As he watched the stream, the familiar knot of anxiety twisted in his stomach. This wasn't just a school issue anymore. It was about to become a community-wide debate, something the media would pick up, something that couldn't be ignored. He reached down to pet Shadow, his fingers brushing through the dog's soft fur. "Here we go," he muttered to the dog, who responded with a soft nudge of his head. Jamal turned to leave the parking lot, determined to get to the rally before it escalated further. He didn't know what was waiting for him, but he knew one thing for sure, this fight wasn't just about a dog. It was about his right to be seen, to be heard, to be safe. And he was going to make sure the world saw that. As he approached the school entrance, a security guard stepped in his path. "You're not allowed to be here," the guard said, his voice low but firm. "I'm going to have to ask you to leave." Jamal stood tall, shadow by his side, the weight of everything crashing in on him. But he didn't budge. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, his voice unwavering. "Not until you listen." The next few days felt like a whirlwind. What had started as a quiet protest, just a handful of students rallying behind Jamal, had quickly spiraled into something much larger. The school's refusal to allow Shadow into the classroom had ignited a firestorm, drawing in students, parents, and even local news stations. The petition that Jamal had reluctantly signed began to snowball, now with thousands of signatures in support of his cause. But with every new name added, with every new person who stood behind him, the pressure also mounted. Principal Holloway had done what she could to contain the situation, calling multiple emergency meetings with the school board, teachers, and even the district's lawyers. But the more she tried to suppress it, the more public attention it gained. The media had shown up at Crestwood's gates. News crews with cameras and microphones interviewed random students as they filed in and out of school. Local radio stations were discussing the issue during their morning shows. People were now watching, waiting to see what would happen next. And it wasn't just the media. Jamal felt the weight of every pair of eyes on him as he walked through the hallways. Some were curious, others sympathetic, but many were still hostile. Every step he took seemed to carry the burden of the entire school's judgment. His teachers, who had once been neutral, now looked at him with a mixture of concern and uncertainty. Jamal had never imagined that something as simple as wanting to feel safe in his own school would turn into such a battle. It was a Friday morning when things took a turn. Jamal entered the cafeteria with Aaliyah and Luis by his side, Shadow at his heels. They'd been avoiding the cafeteria in the past few days. Too many stares, too many whispers. But today, they were determined to keep going. They weren't going to hide. Jamal needed the support of his friends, and they were here for him. They always had been. As they made their way to an empty table in the back corner, Jamal saw a familiar face. It was May, with her camera in hand, her eyes scanning the room. When she caught sight of Jamal, she waved him over. Without hesitation, Jamal, Aaliyah, and Luis made their way to the table. May was already preparing for something bigger, something that Jamal wasn't sure he was ready for. Her camera had become a tool of both documentation and activism, capturing every moment of his journey, whether it was the protests, the meetings, or even the silent moments of doubt he sometimes experienced when no one was looking. "We need to make our next move," May said, her voice steady but determined. "The administration is scrambling. But I think it's time we hit them where it counts." Jamal looked at her, confusion in his eyes. "What do you mean?" "We need to take this to the school board." "Public hearing," she said, her eyes lighting up with the spark of an idea. "Get our parents to show up. Get the media involved. Show them that we're not backing down." Aaliyah leaned forward, a grin spreading across her face. "You know, May's right. The more we make this public, the harder it is for them to ignore us." Jamal felt his pulse quicken. Public hearing. School board. The thought of standing in front of a group of administrators and parents, defending himself and Shadow, made his stomach churn. But he couldn't deny that there was a flicker of excitement beneath the nerves. This was the moment. If he was going to make a real change, it had to be now. "I'm in," he said, after a long pause. "Let's do it." As soon as the words left his mouth, the tension in the room shifted. Luis stood up, clapping his hands together. "Let's go. We'll get a petition together and organize the meeting." Aaliyah's phone buzzed on the table, and she picked it up. Her face shifted from excitement to a more serious expression as she read the message. "Uh-oh," she muttered under her breath. "What?" Jamal asked, concerned. It's the school district, she said, showing them the message on her phone. They've issued a formal statement saying that they're reconsidering their decision. But they want Jamal to meet with the board first. The catch? They've set the meeting for Monday morning, right before the start of school. Jamal's heart sank. He felt the weight of the moment settle in. This was it, the moment when he would have to decide whether to accept the pressure and back down or to push forward and face the full force of the school district's authority. Monday morning. Jamal repeated, his voice barely a whisper. He turned to look at Shadow, who was quietly lying at his feet, sensing his unease. What do I do? Aaliyah put a hand on his shoulder, offering a calm but firm reassurance. You stand your ground. We all stand with you. This isn't just about Shadow. It's about every student who feels like they don't belong, every student who has to fight to be seen, to be heard. Luis nodded. We've got your back, man. You're not doing this alone. Jamal exhaled slowly, the fear still gnawing at him but also something else, a spark of resolve. He wasn't going to back down. He couldn't. I'm ready, he said, his voice stronger than he felt. Let's go to that meeting. Over the weekend, Jamal prepared himself. He read through the documentation again, the mental health evaluations, the letters from his therapist, and the notes from his doctors. He talked to his mom, who promised to stand with him no matter what. The petition was growing, more parents were voicing their support, and the media coverage was only intensifying. But as Monday morning approached, Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that this was his one chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others like him. When he arrived at school on Monday, the air was thick with anticipation. The news vans were already parked out front, cameras and reporters milling around. Students were gathered in small clusters, whispering about what would happen next. Jamal walked past them, his heart pounding. Aaliyah, Luis, and May walked beside him, each of them ready to stand beside him in whatever came next. As he approached the school's main entrance, he saw Principal Holloway standing at the door, her expression unreadable. Jamal, she said, her voice cool but firm. The meeting starts in 10 minutes. Jamal nodded, his hand resting on Shadow's leash. Let's get this over with. The conference room was cold. The kind of cold that settled deep into your bones, making you feel small, insignificant, as if your very presence was being scrutinized and measured. Jamal sat at a long, polished table, his hands folded tightly in his lap. Shadow, the ever-constant companion, was beside him, his presence a quiet anchor in a room full of uncertain, judging eyes. The school board had set the meeting in the early morning, just before the school day began. The long rows of chairs were filled with district officials, teachers, and administrators, all staring at Jamal as if he were a specimen in a lab. There was no warmth here, no sense of support, just the sharp, clinical weight of authority. The only familiar faces were his mother, sitting quietly in the back corner, and May, who was sitting next to Aaliyah and Luis, her camera poised to capture every moment. Jamal's chest tightened. He hadn't expected it to feel this, daunting. The school board was a massive, faceless entity. But now, as he sat in front of them, their power felt real, heavy, and crushing. The room was silent as Principal Holloway stood up at the front, her hands clasped in front of her. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for attending today's emergency meeting. As you are all aware, the issue before us is the request made by Jamal Carter, a student at Crestwood High, to bring his emotional support dog, Shadow, into the classroom. This decision has sparked concern among parents, teachers, and even students regarding the safety and practicality of allowing an animal on campus. Jamal's heart pounded as Holloway's words sank in. It felt as if she were presenting him, and Shadow, as problems to be solved, rather than recognizing them as part of a larger conversation about student well-being and mental health. He could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on him, as if they were waiting for him to speak up, to defend himself. The superintendent, a middle-aged man named Mr. Fitzgerald, cleared his throat before speaking. His voice was firm, almost too formal, as if he were delivering an announcement rather than engaging in a conversation. Jamal, we've reviewed the documentation provided by your family, and we've had discussions with your healthcare providers. We understand the need for support animals in certain situations. However, this is an unusual request. Emotional support animals, while important, are not typically allowed in classrooms. It's a matter of policy, and the district has strict guidelines that we must follow. Jamal felt a lump in his throat. The word stung. He wasn't just a student in need of a reasonable accommodation, he was a problem that needed to be fixed. But he wasn't going to let them dismiss him without a fight. This wasn't just about Shadow, it was about his right to feel safe in a space that was supposed to help him grow, not push him down. Taking a deep breath, Jamal looked up. His voice was steady, though his heart was racing. I understand that this is an unusual request. But the reality is, I can't succeed here without Shadow. He's not just a dog. He's my support, my safety. Without him, I can't function like everyone else. His words hung in the air for a moment, quiet but resolute. The board members exchanged glances, as if weighing his words carefully. A few of them shifted in their seats, uncomfortable with the confrontation. Jamal noticed one of the teachers, Mrs. Ferguson, who had taught him history the previous semester, nodding slightly. Her face softened as if she recognized the vulnerability in his voice. But there was no sign of it from the rest of the board. Mr. Fitzgerald raised his hand, signaling for Jamal to continue. I'm not asking for special treatment, Jamal went on, the words spilling out more freely now. I'm asking for a chance to succeed. To feel like I belong here. Shadow helps me stay grounded, helps me manage my anxiety, my depression. Without him, I struggle. I can't concentrate. I can't focus. And without focus, I fail. Aaliyah and Luis exchanged a quick look from the back of the room. May was filming the entire exchange, her camera capturing the intensity of the moment. Jamal could feel her support, even if he couldn't see it in the faces of the board members. The superintendent stared at him for a moment before speaking again, his voice cold but not unkind. I understand the personal nature of your request, Jamal. And I sympathize with your situation. However, we must also consider the practical implications. Allowing Shadow in the classroom could set a precedent for other students to bring in their animals, and that would create logistical issues. What about students who have allergies? Or students who are afraid of dogs? We have to think about the impact on the entire school. Jamal clenched his fists under the table, feeling the anger rising again. This wasn't about allergies. This wasn't about fear. This was about him having a right to feel safe in a place that was supposed to be a sanctuary for all students. His mental health was just as important as anyone else's. He wasn't going to let them dismiss him again. I don't think it's about setting a precedent, Jamal said, his voice firm. It's about creating an environment where everyone can succeed. Where students like me don't have to feel invisible. I'm not asking for the school to change everything. I'm asking for an accommodation that would help me stay in school, to be successful in school. And that's something every student deserves. There was a moment of silence in the room, a collective pause as Jamal's words sank in. He could see the board members whispering to one another, their faces filled with doubt. For the first time, they weren't looking at him like a problem. They were listening. Then, a voice broke the silence, one of the parents who had been sitting at the back of the room. It was Mrs. Delaney, an older woman with glasses, her hair pulled back in a tight bun. She stood up and spoke with quiet authority. I'm a parent, and I understand the concerns about animals in schools, Mrs. Delaney said, her voice calm but unwavering. But I also understand what it's like to have a child with special needs. My son struggles with anxiety, and I know what it feels like when the school doesn't take that seriously. If Shadow helps Jamal, if that's what he needs to succeed, then why shouldn't we support him? Jamal's heart skipped a beat. The voice of a parent, speaking up for him, for students like him. He had not expected that. Mrs. Delaney's words were like a lifeline, offering him a sense of validation that he hadn't felt before. The board members murmured among themselves, a few nodding in agreement with Mrs. Delaney's point. Mr. Fitzgerald's expression remained unreadable, but Jamal could tell that the tide was shifting. "I think we need to take a moment to discuss this," Mr. Fitzgerald said, his tone more thoughtful than before. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. Jamal sat back in his chair, trying to steady his breathing. Shadow, sensing his unease, laid his head on Jamal's lap, offering comfort. It was as if the dog knew exactly what Jamal needed in that moment. As the board members left to deliberate, the room fell into a hushed silence. Jamal glanced over at his mom, who smiled softly at him, her eyes filled with pride. May gave him a thumbs up, and Aaliyah and Louise stood nearby, offering silent support. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, the people in power were starting to understand. Maybe, they were beginning to see him as a student who deserved the same opportunities as everyone else. The 15 minutes that followed felt like an eternity. Jamal sat at the table, his hands clenched around the edge of the polished surface, his heart racing with uncertainty. Shadow, still by his side, was the only constant in the room. Jamal absent-mindedly ran his fingers through the dog's fur, drawing comfort from the rhythmic movement. He could feel the pressure building, the weight of the entire room bearing down on him. This wasn't just about his request for Shadow anymore. It was about his right to exist fully in this space, to be seen, to be heard. His mother sat in the back, her eyes focused on him, offering silent support. May had her camera poised, capturing the moment as if she could sense that something important was about to happen. Aaliyah and Louise stood nearby, their presence a reminder that Jamal wasn't in this alone. They were with him, and he could feel the strength of their support, their belief in him. As the board members began to filter back into the room, the air grew thick with tension. The murmurs died down, and everyone took their seats, waiting for the moment of truth. Mr. Fitzgerald, the superintendent, stood at the front of the room, his expression serious as he cleared his throat. Jamal could see the weariness in his eyes, the weight of the decision that lay ahead. This wasn't just about Shadow anymore. It was about something deeper, something that extended beyond school policies and district regulations. It was about whether or not this community, this school, was willing to adapt, to be flexible in the face of something new and challenging. "Thank you all for your patience," Mr. Fitzgerald said, his voice carrying the weight of the moment. "We've discussed this at length, and we understand the gravity of this decision. We've heard from Jamal and his family, from the teachers and the parents, and we've taken into account the concerns and considerations of the school board." Jamal's breath caught in his throat. He wanted to speak, to jump up and argue that his need for Shadow wasn't just about his comfort, it was about his survival. But he remained silent, knowing that the decision was no longer in his hands. Mr. Fitzgerald paused, glancing over at Principal Holloway before continuing. "After careful consideration, the school board has come to a decision. We will allow Jamal to bring Shadow into the classroom, with certain conditions in place." Jamal's heart stopped. For a moment, everything seemed to blur. The noise in the room faded, the murmurs and whispers becoming distant. He had heard what the superintendent said, but the words hadn't fully sunk in yet. Shadow could stay. Jamal's eyes darted to his dog, who was now alert, sensing the change in the room. The superintendent's voice brought him back to the present. "The conditions will include regular check-ins with Jamal's healthcare providers, as well as periodic evaluations to ensure that Shadow's presence continues to be beneficial to Jamal's well-being. There will also be guidelines for other students and staff to follow, including proper accommodations for any students who may have allergies or other concerns regarding the dog's presence in the classroom." Jamal felt the tension in his shoulders begin to ease, though he knew this wasn't the end of the battle. It was just the beginning of a new set of challenges, new hurdles to overcome. But for now, for this moment, it felt like a victory, a small one, perhaps, but a victory nonetheless. The board members nodded in agreement, and Jamal could see the slight relief in their faces. Some of them seemed uncomfortable with the decision, but others looked more thoughtful, as if they were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about one student's request, but about the larger conversation on inclusivity, mental health, and the need for schools to evolve. Principal Holloway cleared her throat, signaling that the meeting was nearing its end. We will be working closely with Jamal and his family to ensure that the transition goes smoothly. I expect full cooperation from the teachers and staff to make this a positive experience for everyone. The room erupted into a low murmur, the tension ebbing away, but Jamal remained seated, still processing the weight of the decision. He hadn't fully understood how much this moment would mean to him. All the fear, all the doubt, all the uncertainty, it had led to this. Jamal, May called softly from the back of the room, her voice cutting through the lingering silence. You did it. Jamal looked up to see her beaming at him, her camera lowered for a moment, though he could still see the glint of pride in her eyes. He nodded slowly, still not quite able to believe it. Aaliyah and Luis were by his side in an instant, their faces lit with smiles of triumph. We did it, Luis said, clapping him on the back. Jamal turned to look at his mom, who was now standing at the back, her hands clasped together, her face shining with pride. She gave him a small, encouraging nod, and in that moment, Jamal knew that this wasn't just his victory, it was their victory. He had fought, and they had stood by him. Together, they had made it happen. But even as he felt the warmth of their support, a new sense of responsibility settled on him. This was far from over. The victory today was a step forward, but it didn't erase the deeper issues that still needed to be addressed. This was about more than just one student and one dog. It was about creating an environment where all students could thrive, where differences were celebrated, not tolerated. As Jamal left the meeting room, his heart still racing but filled with a new sense of purpose, he could hear the soft click of May's camera as she captured this moment for posterity. But for Jamal, it was about more than the picture. It was about the future where students like him, with their challenges and their strengths, could find a place to belong. The fight wasn't over, but Jamal felt stronger now. With Shadow by his side and his community behind him, he was ready for whatever came next. The bell rang, signaling the start of another school day. Jamal stood at the entrance of his classroom, the familiar noise of students rushing to their seats filling the air. His heart was pounding in his chest, a mixture of excitement and nervousness coursing through him. Today would be different. Today, Shadow was with him, officially, and without question. He adjusted his backpack and glanced down at his dog, who was sitting patiently at his side. Shadow's eyes met his with a steady, knowing look, as if to reassure Jamal that they were in this together, as always. The students in the hallways glanced at them curiously, some smiling at the sight of the black lab, others frowning with uncertainty. Jamal had anticipated this moment, but it didn't make it any easier. As he stepped into the classroom, all eyes turned toward him. The room fell into a brief silence, the students unsure how to react to the new addition. It wasn't just a dog. It was a statement, a symbol of Jamal's fight for inclusion, for acceptance. Jamal's heart rate quickened, but he didn't back down. He walked to his desk, Shadow following closely behind him, his tail wagging cautiously. Ms. Roberts, the teacher, greeted him with a tentative smile, but Jamal could see the uncertainty in her eyes. She had been one of the few teachers who had supported him from the beginning, but now she had to navigate the new reality of having a dog in the classroom. She gestured toward the space beside Jamal's desk. Jamal, I'm glad to see you here today, she said, her voice steady, though there was a hint of discomfort. I'm sure this will take some getting used to for all of us, but I'm happy to work with you and Shadow. Jamal nodded, trying to calm his nerves. He had worked so hard to get to this point. The last thing he wanted was for things to be awkward, to feel like an outsider in his own classroom. But the reality was, it wouldn't be easy. The students began to take their seats, some casting furtive glances at the dog, others whispering to their friends. Jamal heard snippets of conversation. Is that a real service dog? I heard he needs it for his anxiety. I don't know about this. The whispers weren't all bad, but they weren't exactly supportive either. As the lesson began, Jamal did his best to focus. Shadow sat calmly beside him, but Jamal could feel the dog's energy, a quiet tension beneath the calm demeanor. He knew that today wouldn't be the easy day he had hoped for. The dog was there, yes, but it felt like every other student was still adjusting to the idea. Jamal's classmates had seen him before, but they hadn't truly known him. They hadn't understood the battles he fought every day, the reasons why Shadow was so important to him. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur. Jamal struggled to concentrate, not because he wasn't interested, but because he could feel the weight of the room's judgment. Every glance felt like a small jolt, each whisper a reminder of how different he was from everyone else. Even the students who had been supportive earlier now seemed unsure, glancing at Shadow and at Jamal in a way that made him feel exposed, vulnerable. As the bell rang and the students filed out, Jamal sat at his desk for a moment, trying to collect his thoughts. Shadow had stood up when the bell rang, his tail wagging in the quiet space between them. Jamal looked down at his dog and took a deep breath. "It's going to be okay, boy," Jamal whispered to Shadow. "We just have to get through this together." But getting through it wasn't going to be that simple. The next few days were a blur of uncertainty and awkwardness. Some students, like May, Luis, and Aaliyah, continued to offer their support, but the majority of the class seemed hesitant, unsure of how to act. Jamal overheard whispered comments about the dog, the rules, and his special treatment, and every time, a knot tightened in his chest. At lunch, Jamal sat with May, Aaliyah, and Luis in their usual spot in the cafeteria, but today, it felt different. The students who usually filled the tables around them now kept their distance, glancing over at Jamal and Shadow with uncertainty. May was the first to break the silence. "Jamal, how are you doing?" she asked gently, her eyes filled with concern. "It's gotta be a little rough, huh?" Jamal shrugged, trying to appear calm. "I'm fine. Just, not sure how long it's gonna take for everyone to get used to it." Luis, who was usually the more optimistic of the group, nodded. "It's not like anyone else has a dog in class. It's new for everyone. But you know, the more people see Shadow, the more they'll get used to it. And they'll see how helpful he is." Aaliyah added, "People are always scared of what they don't understand. Once they realize Shadow's not here to hurt anyone, they'll relax." Jamal smiled at his friends, grateful for their support. But deep down, he knew it wouldn't be that simple. The truth was, he didn't just need the approval of his friends. He needed the rest of the school, the teachers, the students, the administrators, to see that Shadow was more than just a dog. He was a lifeline. As the days went on, Jamal started to notice the subtle changes. Some of the teachers began to treat him differently, with more understanding, as if Shadow had given them permission to see Jamal not as a problem, but as a person with real needs. Ms. Roberts, in particular, seemed more relaxed around him. She had been one of the few who had acknowledged his struggles before the board meeting, and now she made sure that he always had a seat near Shadow, offering him a bit more space when things got overwhelming. Still, the whispers didn't stop. The murmur of judgment lingered in the hallways, the cafeteria, the classrooms. Jamal couldn't escape it. Every step he took, every moment he shared with his friends, felt like he was carrying the weight of everyone's opinions, their expectations, their misconceptions. One afternoon, after a particularly challenging class, Jamal found himself standing in front of the school counselor's office, his hand hovering over the door. He hadn't seen Mr. Thompson in a while, and the pressure of the last few days had worn him down. He needed to talk to someone who wouldn't judge him, who wouldn't look at him and see only the struggles. He needed to speak to someone who understood. Taking a deep breath, Jamal pushed open the door and stepped inside. Mr. Thompson was sitting behind his desk, going over some paperwork when Jamal walked in. The counselor looked up and smiled warmly, his eyes soft with understanding. "Jamal," Mr. Thompson said, standing up. "It's good to see you. How are you holding up?" Jamal sat down in the chair across from him, looking down at his hands. It's tough," he admitted. "I thought it would be easier, but it's like every day, I'm reminded that I'm different." "That Shadow's different." Mr. Thompson nodded, his expression sympathetic. "I can imagine it's not easy. But remember, Jamal, what you're doing here, what you're asking for, isn't just for you. You're creating space for others who might feel the same way you do. It may take time, but eventually, others will see the value in what you're doing. You're not just advocating for yourself. You're advocating for change." Jamal looked up at him, surprised by the counselor's words. It wasn't something he had thought about in those terms. But in that moment, it clicked. This fight wasn't just about his comfort or his needs. It was about showing everyone, his classmates, his teachers, that there was more to each of them than meets the eye. It was about shifting perspectives and opening hearts, one step at a time. "Thanks, Mr. Thompson," Jamal said, feeling a bit lighter. "I needed to hear that." As he left the office, Jamal felt a renewed sense of determination. The journey wasn't easy, and it wasn't going to get any easier. But he wasn't alone. Shadow was with him, and so were his friends, his family, and even those who had yet to understand. He was fighting for something bigger than himself. And he wasn't going to stop now. The air in the school seemed thicker now, laden with whispers and unspoken tension. Jamal knew the initial excitement had worn off, and now the reality of his situation was settling in. It wasn't just the students who were uncertain anymore. There were whispers among the teachers, and more troubling, among the parents. The community was divided, and Jamal, whether he liked it or not, had become the center of a much larger debate than he ever anticipated. It wasn't until that Wednesday afternoon that Jamal began to understand the full scope of the storm he was caught in. It started with a note, an anonymous letter slipped under the door of Principal Holloway's office. Jamal wasn't sure who had written it, but he had a feeling he knew. In fact, he had already heard the rumors swirling among the parent-teacher meetings, the murmurs in the hallways. The letter was clear in its demands: remove the dog. It's disruptive to the learning environment. Jamal could feel the weight of the letter in his chest, the anger and frustration rising like a tide. His mind raced, each thought a mixture of disbelief and fury. How could anyone not see that Shadow wasn't the problem? That this wasn't just about a dog in a classroom, it was about him, about his needs, his mental health, his right to be part of the school without constant fear of judgment. But Jamal didn't say anything. He couldn't. Principal Holloway had called him into her office the next morning. The letter had caused quite a stir. She had reassured him that she would support him, but Jamal could see the hesitancy in her eyes. It wasn't just the parents, some of the teachers were starting to complain as well. They felt that Shadow was distracting, that the classroom was no longer the same. Even Ms. Roberts, who had been the most understanding, was becoming more cautious in her approach. Jamal could tell she was uncomfortable, though she still smiled at him every time they spoke. "We've received several concerns," Principal Holloway said, her tone softer than usual. "From parents, from staff. It's not that they don't care about you, Jamal. They do. But there's a feeling that the presence of a dog is creating a distraction. Some of the parents feel that their children are being unfairly affected." Jamal's chest tightened at the words. He knew this was coming. The more he thought about it, the more it seemed like everyone was focused on the dog, not on the bigger picture. He wanted to yell, to demand that they understand, but instead, he took a deep breath, trying to keep his voice steady. "Shadow isn't just a dog," Jamal said, his voice surprisingly calm. "He's my support. Without him, I can't focus. I can't function. The classroom, the school, was already a place where I felt like I didn't belong. He's the reason I can even be here." Principal Holloway nodded, but there was a faint trace of worry in her eyes. I understand, Jamal. Truly, I do. But this is going to be harder than we thought. We may need to revisit the conditions of his presence here. Perhaps even hold a meeting with the parents to hear their concerns. We can't ignore the voices of the entire school community. Jamal's heart sank. Are you saying I could lose him? The words hung in the air between them. Principal Holloway didn't respond immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze filled with sympathy. I'm not saying that, she replied gently. But I want you to be prepared for the possibility that this might not be as simple as we hoped. We have to consider everyone, students, parents, staff. It's a delicate balance. Jamal wanted to argue. To fight. But instead, he just nodded. He didn't want to lose Shadow. He couldn't. But at the same time, the reality of the situation was clear. This fight wasn't going to be easy. It was just beginning. The next few days were filled with a strange kind of tension. Jamal could feel it in every hallway he walked through, every classroom he entered. His classmates were still adjusting, but now, even the ones who had been supportive were starting to pull back. The whispers had grown louder. He heard things like, "It's just a dog, why can't he just take his issues somewhere else?" And it stung every time. Even May, Aaliyah, and Louise seemed distracted, caught between their support for Jamal and the pressure of the growing discontent around them. At lunch one day, May spoke up, her voice soft but filled with concern. "Jamal, I heard some of the teachers talking," she said, her brow furrowed. "They're not happy. A lot of them are saying that it's affecting the students' concentration. Some of the parents are threatening to pull their kids out if this continues." Jamal felt his stomach drop. He had known this was coming, but hearing it out loud made it feel real. "What do they want me to do?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Should I just leave? Should I just pretend that I don't need Shadow?" May reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "No, Jamal. You shouldn't have to leave. But, maybe there's a way we can get through this. Maybe we can get people to understand." "I've tried," Jamal said, shaking his head. "I've tried talking, explaining. I don't know what else to do." Aaliyah, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up then. "You know we're with you, Jamal. But this isn't just about the dog. It's about the way people see you. The way they see us. They think we're too different to fit in. But we belong here. And if we have to fight for it, we will." Jamal looked at his friends, feeling a renewed sense of determination. They were right. This wasn't just about Shadow. This was about proving that he belonged here, just as much as anyone else. He wasn't going to back down. Not now. The next morning, Jamal made a decision. He wasn't going to wait for the school to decide his fate. He wasn't going to let his future, his ability to be who he truly was, be determined by people who didn't understand. That afternoon, he would speak at the next school board meeting. The school board meeting was set for 4 p.m., and Jamal knew this was the moment that would either solidify his place or push him further into the shadows. He had prepared his speech carefully, every word calculated to express not just his need for Shadow, but the larger issue of acceptance. He was ready, but the weight of what he was about to do pressed down on him like never before. He stood with his mother by his side in the back of the meeting room, his heart pounding as he listened to the board members discuss the ongoing concerns. Parents were speaking up, voicing their dissatisfaction with the situation, some even demanding that the school enforce a no-pet policy. When Jamal's turn came, he stood up, his legs feeling like jelly but his resolve stronger than ever. He could hear his breath echoing in his ears as he stepped to the podium, his eyes scanning the faces in front of him. This was his moment to show them who he really was, and why Shadow wasn't just a luxury, but a lifeline. "Good afternoon," he began, his voice steady despite the nerves. "I'm Jamal. And this is Shadow." He gestured to the dog sitting beside him, who was quietly resting at his feet. I know that some of you are uncomfortable with the idea of having a dog in the classroom. I know it's not something that happens every day. But I need you to understand that Shadow isn't here because I want something special. He's here because I need him. Without him, I can't make it through a day at school. He paused, taking a deep breath before continuing. I'm asking for your understanding, not just for me, but for all the students who struggle with mental health, with anxiety, with feeling like they don't belong. We need to create a space where everyone can feel safe, supported, and understood. And that means we need to be flexible. We need to be open to change. Jamal looked out at the board members, his gaze firm and unwavering. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was for every student who had ever felt like they didn't fit in, who had ever felt like they didn't matter. I'm asking you to see me for who I am, not just a student who needs accommodations, but a student who belongs here, just like everyone else. Jamal finished, his heart racing, but feeling more at peace than he had in days. He had said everything he needed to say. Now, all he could do was wait for their response. Jamal sat in the back of the room, his hands clenched tightly in his lap as the members of the school board began their deliberation. The air felt thick with anticipation, every voice in the room muted by the gravity of the moment. His mother sat beside him, her eyes filled with a quiet determination that mirrored his own. They had fought for this moment, and now it was time to see if it would be enough. The school board members exchanged glances, their faces a mix of uncertainty and resolve. The tension in the room was palpable, and Jamal could feel every second stretching out before him, like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. Principal Holloway had just finished her report, detailing the concerns of both the students and parents. While she had expressed her support for Jamal and Shadow, she had also made it clear that the situation was more complicated than they had anticipated. The question on everyone's mind was clear: should the school make an exception and allow Shadow to remain, or should they adhere to the rules and ask Jamal to find another way to cope with his challenges? Jamal could feel the eyes of the entire room on him, but he held his ground, refusing to look away. This was his moment to make them understand. To show them that his request was not unreasonable. The board members began to speak, and their words felt like blades cutting through the thick silence. I understand that Jamal is going through something difficult, one of the board members, Mrs. Thompson, said, her voice firm but compassionate. But we have to consider the larger picture. The school has rules for a reason. If we make an exception for Jamal, what happens when other students come forward with similar requests? What if every student starts bringing in pets for emotional support? Jamal's stomach churned. He had known that this argument would come up, but hearing it now, so bluntly, hurt more than he expected. It wasn't just about the dog. It was about his needs, his right to feel safe and supported. But how could he make them understand that? Mrs. Thompson continued, I sympathize with Jamal, but we also need to think about the other students who are not comfortable with this. We can't ignore their feelings, either. Another board member, Mr. Green, a tall man with graying hair, spoke up. I agree that we need to consider everyone involved. But we can't ignore the fact that Jamal's mental health is a priority. If he needs Shadow to feel safe and able to learn, we should find a way to make this work. But it's a difficult decision. Jamal's heart pounded in his chest. He could see that the room was divided. There were those who sympathized with him, who understood that his struggle was real. And then there were those who saw the rules as black and white, who couldn't see past their own discomfort. He knew the decision would come down to this: who would win, the need for change or the fear of breaking tradition? The room fell silent as another board member, Mrs. Delgado, spoke up. Her voice was calm but insistent. I've spoken to some of the parents, and I understand their concerns. But I also think we're missing a key point here. We're here to educate the whole child, not just their academic performance. Jamal's mental health, his well-being, is just as important as his grades. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time, Jamal felt a flicker of hope. Could it be possible? Could there be enough people on his side to make a change? Mrs. Thompson, however, wasn't ready to concede. I understand that, Mrs. Delgado. But we also need to think about the safety of all students. If we allow pets in the classroom, where does it end? Do we start bringing in other animals for other students with needs? There's a line we need to draw. Jamal clenched his fists, fighting the urge to stand up and shout. He had heard this argument before, and he wasn't going to back down now. This wasn't about the dog. This was about him. This was about his right to feel included, to feel like he wasn't a burden to anyone just because of his mental health. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was his lifeline. He felt his mother's hand on his shoulder, her gentle touch grounding him. "You've done everything you could," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the murmurs in the room. "You've spoken from your heart. No matter what happens, you've shown them who you are." Jamal nodded, though he wasn't sure if he believed it. But what else could he do? This wasn't just a school policy or a pet issue, it was a matter of respect. A matter of his dignity. And he wouldn't let them take that away. The board continued to debate, their voices growing more heated as the minutes stretched into an hour. Some board members, like Mrs. Delgado, argued that the school needed to be more accommodating. Others, like Mrs. Thompson, insisted that the rules were there for a reason, and changing them could open a floodgate of requests that the school might not be able to handle. Jamal's mind raced. He thought of everything he had been through, every sleepless night, every moment of anxiety, every time he had felt like an outsider. Shadow had given him a sense of security he never thought possible. And now, standing in front of these adults, he was asking for something he never thought he'd have to ask for, the right to exist as he was, to be seen as more than just a problem to be solved. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the chairman of the board, Mr. Harris, called the meeting to order. "It's clear that we have a divided opinion on this matter," Mr. Harris said, his voice firm. "But we must come to a decision. I propose that we allow a trial period for Jamal and Shadow to remain in the classroom, with certain conditions. During this time, we will monitor the impact on both Jamal and the other students, and we will reassess the situation at the end of the semester." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. A trial period? It wasn't a permanent solution, but it was a start. It meant that he wouldn't be forced to leave right away. Mrs. Thompson frowned. "A trial period is fine, but we should be clear that this is not a permanent arrangement. We'll need to evaluate the results carefully." Mr. Harris nodded. "Agreed. The trial period will give us time to assess the situation and make an informed decision. If it's determined that this arrangement isn't working for the school community, we'll revisit the policy. But for now, we'll allow this to proceed." Jamal felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't the end of the fight, but it was a victory. Shadow could stay, for now. He wasn't sure how long it would last, but for the first time in weeks, he felt like he had a chance. He turned to his mother, a smile breaking through his anxiety. "We did it," he whispered. She squeezed his hand, her eyes shining with pride. "No, Jamal. You did it." The room erupted into murmurs, and Jamal felt the eyes of everyone on him. This wasn't the end of the battle, but it was a step forward, a small victory that would give him the time and space he needed to prove that he belonged. As he left the room, Shadow at his side, Jamal knew that this was only the beginning of a much larger fight. But he was ready. The days that followed the school board meeting were filled with a mix of relief and tension. The trial period for Jamal and Shadow had been approved, but Jamal knew that the real challenge had only just begun. Now, more than ever, he had to prove that the arrangement could work, that Shadow wasn't just a crutch for him, but a vital part of his ability to succeed. At first, everything seemed to go as planned. Jamal was allowed to bring Shadow to school every day, and they settled into a new routine. Shadow would lay quietly beside Jamal's desk during lessons, his presence comforting Jamal as he worked through the challenges of each day. Jamal noticed that he was able to focus better, the anxiety that had once gripped him now eased by Shadow's calm presence. His classmates, though still adjusting, were beginning to accept it. Some of the teachers even seemed to understand. But even as Jamal began to feel more at ease, there was still an underlying sense of unease in the air. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were just quieter now, more subtle. Jamal could feel the judgment, the skepticism, even though no one was vocalizing it. But he didn't mind as much anymore. He had Shadow by his side, and that was enough. It wasn't until a week into the trial period that something unexpected happened. It was a Wednesday afternoon, and Jamal was sitting in the back of the classroom, working on a math assignment. Shadow lay quietly at his feet, his steady breathing the only sound in the otherwise quiet room. Jamal had been making progress, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like he was actually succeeding in school. He wasn't just getting by. He was thriving. But then, something shifted in the air. Jamal's concentration faltered, and he looked up. At the front of the room, Mr. Morrison, the history teacher, was standing by the whiteboard, explaining a lesson. Jamal hadn't noticed it before, but something about the way Mr. Morrison was looking at him now felt different. There was a hardness in his gaze, an expression that Jamal hadn't seen from him before. Mr. Morrison was a teacher Jamal had always admired. He was approachable, patient, and fair. But today, Jamal could see that something was off. After class, as students began to file out of the room, Jamal was gathering his things when Mr. Morrison approached him. His tone was calm, but there was a certain coldness in his voice. "Jamal, can I talk to you for a moment?" Mr. Morrison asked. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Something in Mr. Morrison's voice made Jamal feel uneasy. He nodded, pushing the thoughts of concern aside. "Sure, Mr. Morrison. What's up?" Mr. Morrison glanced at Shadow, who was now sitting beside Jamal's chair, looking up at the teacher with mild curiosity. "It's about the dog, Jamal. I think it's time we talked about it." Jamal felt a tightening in his chest. He had braced himself for these kinds of conversations, but the words still stung. "I know the school board approved the trial period," Mr. Morrison continued. "But I've been hearing things. Some of the other teachers are uncomfortable. Some of the students are too. There's a lot of talk going around. And I think it's starting to affect the learning environment." Jamal's mind raced, but he held his ground. He could feel Shadow's presence at his side, grounding him. "I'm not asking for special treatment," Jamal said, his voice steady. "I just need Shadow here so I can focus. Without him, I can't learn. You've seen that, haven't you? I'm doing better in class now. I'm participating. I'm not just sitting in the back anymore, lost in my thoughts." Mr. Morrison didn't respond immediately. Instead, he shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Shadow again before turning back to Jamal. "You have to understand, Jamal," Mr. Morrison said slowly. "It's not about whether you're doing better or not. It's about the overall classroom environment. We can't just allow animals in here because one student needs it. It's a matter of policy, of fairness to the others." Jamal's stomach sank. "So, what do you want me to do? Give up on everything I've worked for? Let my anxiety take over again?" Mr. Morrison hesitated, his face softening slightly. "I'm not saying that. But I think we need to find a balance. You're not the only one who's struggling, Jamal. I understand that Shadow helps you, but what about the others? What about the students who are afraid of dogs? What about the allergies? We have to think about the bigger picture." Jamal's frustration bubbled up, but he fought to keep his voice calm. "I get that, Mr. Morrison. I do. But what about me? What about my mental health? Shadow helps me manage my anxiety. Without him, I wouldn't be able to be here. I wouldn't even be able to talk to you right now." There was a long pause. Mr. Morrison seemed to consider this, his expression shifting from irritation to contemplation. Finally, He sighed and looked down at the floor. You know, Jamal, he said quietly, I've been teaching for a long time. And I've seen a lot of students who've struggled. But I've never had a student who had the courage to stand up for themselves like you have. I respect that. Jamal blinked, surprised by the sudden shift in Mr. Morrison's tone. Wait, what do you mean? Mr. Morrison looked up, his eyes softer now. I mean that I've seen the way you've been working. I've seen the way you've been trying. I see that you're not just asking for a free pass. You're asking for a chance. And you're not giving up on yourself. That's something I can respect. Jamal felt a surge of emotion in his chest, a mix of gratitude and disbelief. He hadn't expected this. He hadn't expected Mr. Morrison, of all people, to understand. But there it was, an ally, someone who saw more than just a student with a dog. He saw a person who was fighting for their place in the world. Mr. Morrison leaned in slightly. I can't promise that things will be easy, Jamal. I can't promise that the others will accept this. But I will promise that I'll support you. I'll do what I can to help you make this work. And if it means talking to the other teachers, I'll do that too. Jamal's heart swelled. Thank you, Mr. Morrison. That means a lot to me. Mr. Morrison smiled, though it was tinged with a hint of sadness. Just don't let it get to you too much, okay? It's not going to be perfect, but you've got to keep pushing forward. Don't let anyone tell you that you don't belong here. Jamal nodded, his resolve strengthening. This wasn't just about Shadow. It was about proving that he had a right to exist, a right to be here, and that his needs mattered as much as anyone else's. As Jamal left the classroom that day, Shadow walking faithfully by his side, he felt a newfound sense of hope. The road ahead was still uncertain. There would be challenges, more arguments, and likely more uncomfortable conversations. But for the first time, he felt like he wasn't alone. He had someone in his corner. He had an ally. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The days after his conversation with Mr. Morrison were both comforting and unnerving. Jamal had left that meeting feeling lighter, as if the burden on his shoulders had been shared by someone who truly understood him. But as the trial period for Shadow continued, the tension at school seemed to grow rather than subside. What had started as whispers now felt like a loud undercurrent of resistance, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that he was constantly being watched, his every move scrutinized, his every action judged. As the weeks passed, Jamal began to feel the weight of the trial period more than ever. His classmates were growing restless, and the teachers were divided. On some days, it seemed like they were trying to ignore Shadow's presence, while on others, it felt as though they were conspiring behind closed doors to find a way to end it. The most noticeable changes were the small but sharp glances he would receive in the halls, the hushed conversations when he walked by, and the subtle tension in the classrooms when Shadow was with him. One afternoon, during a history class, Jamal could feel the eyes of his classmates on him, just like he always did. Shadow lay quietly under his desk, his eyes half closed, the soft sound of his breathing providing a steady rhythm to the classroom. But today, something felt different. Jamal couldn't focus on the lesson. His stomach twisted in knots, his thoughts clouded by the sense of isolation that always seemed to follow him lately. Mr. Morrison had noticed it too. He'd been increasingly distant since their conversation, and Jamal couldn't figure out why. It wasn't that he was outright hostile, but there was a certain coldness in his demeanor that Jamal couldn't ignore. The once approachable teacher seemed to have put a wall up, and Jamal couldn't help but feel that the warmth he'd felt during their conversation had faded. The class ended, and Jamal quickly gathered his things. Shadow stood beside him, stretching as Jamal stood up, feeling the familiar weight of anxiety settling in. He wanted to talk to Mr. Morrison, but he didn't know how to address the shift that had occurred. He was afraid that if he pushed too hard, he might lose the one ally he had in the school. As Jamal walked out of the classroom, he was met with a familiar sight, a group of students standing at the lockers, talking in low voices. As he passed by, he overheard a few snatches of conversation. "I can't believe they're letting a dog into the classroom. It's so unfair to the rest of us," one girl whispered, her voice tinged with frustration. "Yeah, I heard someone had an allergy." "It's really inconsiderate," another student chimed in. Jamal's heart sank. These weren't just whispers anymore, they were open discussions about his presence, about the dog that was making everyone uncomfortable. Jamal's mind raced. The trial period hadn't even ended yet, and already the backlash was taking a toll. The tension was thick in the hallways, and Jamal couldn't shake the feeling that the next few weeks would determine everything. That afternoon, as Jamal sat down in the cafeteria, he noticed that the usual group of students he had once eaten lunch with had scattered. He was left sitting alone, the empty seats around him feeling like an unspoken statement. Even though Shadow was lying calmly on the floor next to his feet, Jamal couldn't ignore the growing sense of alienation. The stares from across the cafeteria were unmistakable, and he couldn't pretend like everything was fine anymore. After lunch, Jamal walked to his next class with Shadow at his side. As they reached the door, Jamal hesitated for a moment. He could feel the tension in the air before he even stepped inside. When he opened the door, the room fell silent, and all eyes turned to him. It wasn't the silence of respect, it was the silence of discomfort, of judgment. Mr. Green, the teacher for the next class, stood at the front, his arms folded as he regarded Jamal and Shadow. There was something different about his expression today, something colder. "You're late," Mr. Green said, his voice clipped, though his eyes kept flicking toward Shadow. "I'm sorry, Mr. Green," Jamal muttered, feeling the weight of his words settle like lead in his chest. "I was talking to Mr. Morrison." Mr. Green didn't respond right away. Instead, he cleared his throat and walked over to Jamal's desk. Shadow shifted at Jamal's side, sensing his discomfort. "Mr. Green glanced down at the dog, then back at Jamal, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I don't think this is going to work, Jamal," Mr. Green said, his tone stern. "You're making this difficult for everyone. You're disrupting the class, and frankly, it's getting out of hand." Jamal's stomach tightened. "I'm not trying to disrupt anything," he said, his voice trembling. "I just need Shadow here. He helps me focus." "You're not the only one with challenges, Jamal," Mr. Green replied, his voice growing harsher. "We all have problems, but we don't get to bring dogs into class because of it. You're making this harder on everyone." Jamal felt his throat tighten, the familiar knot of anxiety creeping in. He knew this was coming, but it still felt like a punch to the gut. The words stung more than he thought they would. Shadow let out a small, comforting whine beside him, but it wasn't enough to break the tension in the room. "I'm sorry, Mr. Green," Jamal said quietly, his voice almost drowned out by the murmur of the class. "I didn't mean to make it difficult. I need Shadow." Mr. Green looked down at him, his expression unreadable. "You need to understand that you're not the only one in this school, Jamal. We have rules, and we have to follow them. If you can't understand that, maybe you shouldn't bring him here anymore." Jamal felt his heart sink. He couldn't let go of Shadow. Shadow wasn't just a dog, he was the only thing keeping him from falling apart. But if Mr. Green and the other teachers didn't understand, how could he make them see? That evening, Jamal sat at the kitchen table, his head buried in his hands. Shadow was lying quietly at his feet, his presence a constant, calming force. But Jamal couldn't ignore the growing weight in his chest. This was getting harder. The support from some teachers, like Mr. Morrison, was becoming more isolated. And with each passing day, it felt like there were more obstacles, more people questioning his need for Shadow, more whispers, more people judging him for something that was beyond his control. His mom entered the room, her face etched with concern. "Jamal, what's going on? You've been quiet all evening." Jamal looked up at her, his voice shaky. They're all against me, Mom. It's not just the students anymore. The teachers don't get it either. Mr. Green said I was disrupting the class. He told me to leave Shadow at home. His mother's expression softened as she sat down beside him. Jamal, I know this isn't easy. But you have to remember, what you're asking for is important. It's not just about a dog. It's about your well-being, your health. Jamal nodded, though the tears threatening to spill from his eyes made it hard to speak. But how do I make them understand that? How do I make them see I need him? His mother took his hand gently. You don't have to do it alone. We'll figure this out together, okay? You don't give up. You're not just some student, they can't just ignore what you need. Jamal nodded, trying to swallow the lump in his throat. But deep down, he knew that this wasn't just a fight for him anymore, it was a fight for everyone who felt unseen, unheard, and alone. As he looked at Shadow, his heart steadied. The road ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear, Jamal wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. The weight of the classroom, the murmurs of his classmates, the growing distance between him and the teachers, it all felt like too much. But something inside Jamal shifted. He had spent so long being silent, hiding behind his anxiety, allowing others to dictate his reality. That was changing. He wasn't going to let anyone dismiss him or Shadow again, not without a fight. The next morning, as Jamal walked into school, he had a clear sense of purpose. He hadn't told anyone, least of all his mom, what he was planning. But he was done waiting for someone else to validate his need for Shadow. If the teachers and students couldn't understand that Shadow was more than a dog to him, he was going to make them understand. It wasn't just about bringing Shadow to school anymore. It was about proving to everyone that he belonged. Jamal was tired of being treated like his needs didn't matter, tired of the constant whispers and sidelong glances. He was going to stand up for himself, no matter the cost. The first step in his plan was simple, he didn't say a word. He didn't make a big scene. Instead, Jamal took a seat in his first class, Shadow lying quietly next to him as always. He could feel the tension in the air immediately. His classmates glanced over, and a few looked as if they were going to speak, but they quickly turned back to their work. But Jamal didn't look at them. He didn't acknowledge them. He just kept his focus on the lesson, his hands steady as he took notes, with Shadow there to ground him. By the time the bell rang, signaling the end of the period, Jamal could tell something had shifted. His classmates weren't talking to him, but they weren't making fun of him either. They seemed confused, maybe even a little wary. No one challenged him directly, but the message was clear, Jamal was going to continue bringing Shadow to school, whether they liked it or not. But it wasn't just about the students, he could feel the teachers' eyes on him as well. Mr. Green, the history teacher who had told him to leave Shadow at home, didn't say a word during class. He didn't even acknowledge Shadow's presence. Jamal noticed it, the way Mr. Green kept his gaze on the board, the way he avoided looking at Jamal altogether. And yet, there was something in his eyes that was different. It wasn't the coldness Jamal had seen before. It was uncertainty. Maybe even fear. Jamal's second class of the day was even more telling. As he sat down, the classroom seemed to hold its breath. Shadow lay beside his desk, as calm as ever. The silence that hung in the air was thick with expectation. And then, as if on cue, one of his classmates, Carla, who had been one of the more vocal opponents of Shadow's presence, stood up. She looked around the room, her hands folded tightly in front of her. The entire class turned their attention to her. "I don't think this is okay," Carla said loudly, her voice echoing in the stillness. "I mean, look at this. There's a dog in here. What about people who are allergic? What about the other students? This is just not fair." Her words hung in the air, heavy with judgment. For a moment, Jamal's heart raced. He knew this was coming. He knew that there would be a confrontation sooner or later. He took a deep breath and stood up, his voice calm but firm. "I understand your concerns, Carla," Jamal said, his voice steady. "But Shadow helps me. He's not just a pet. He's not here for you, or for anyone else. He's here because I need him. Without him, I can't focus. I can't learn." The classroom was silent. Jamal could feel all eyes on him, some with pity, others with disbelief. But he stood his ground, feeling the presence of Shadow beside him, grounding him in the moment. Carla looked around at the class, clearly unsure of how to respond. The tension in the room grew thick, the silence deafening. Then, as if on cue, another student, Jason, who had always been more quiet and reserved, raised his hand. "I think Jamal has a point," Jason said, his voice surprisingly strong for someone who rarely spoke up in class. "I mean, he's not doing anything wrong. If Shadow helps him, what's the problem? It's not like the dog is bothering anyone." Jamal blinked in surprise. Jason had always been a background player in class, never one to get involved in discussions. But today, his voice cut through the tension, and Jamal couldn't help but feel a small sense of hope rise in his chest. "I agree," another voice chimed in. It was Sarah, a student who had always sat near Jamal in the back of the class. "We've all got our struggles. If bringing Shadow helps Jamal focus, then who are we to judge?" The words were like a breath of fresh air. Jamal looked around the room, seeing his classmates starting to shift. There were a few who were still visibly uncomfortable, but there were more who were beginning to speak up, their voices tentative but growing in strength. "I don't know about you guys, but I'd rather have a dog in class than someone being too anxious to learn," Sarah added, her tone growing more confident. Jamal's heart swelled. For the first time since the trial period began, he felt the support of his classmates, the people who had once been part of the crowd that whispered and judged. Now, they were standing with him, and it felt like a small but significant victory. But the real challenge still lay ahead. The teachers, who had been quiet so far, were beginning to stir. Mr. Green was still standing at the front, his arms crossed, watching the interaction unfold with a furrowed brow. It was clear that he didn't expect this kind of support from the students. His stance remained cold and distant, but the uncertainty in his eyes was unmistakable. At the end of the class, as the students filed out, Jamal felt a wave of exhaustion wash over him. He had never been one to seek confrontation, but today had been different. He had stood up for himself, and it had worked. For the first time in weeks, he didn't feel alone. Later that day, Jamal received an unexpected message from Sarah, who had been one of the students to speak up during class. "Hey, Jamal," her message began. "I just wanted to say that I'm really proud of you for standing up like that. It can't be easy. If you ever need someone to talk to, I'm here." Jamal smiled at the message, feeling a sense of gratitude towards Sarah that he hadn't expected. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make him feel like he wasn't fighting this battle alone. And with every bit of support, Jamal's resolve grew stronger. The battle wasn't over, but Jamal had taken the first step toward showing everyone that he deserved to be there, that his needs were valid, and that he would no longer be silent. This wasn't just about Shadow, it was about his right to be heard, to be seen, and to be treated with the same respect as everyone else. Jamal's quiet protest was beginning to ripple through the school. What had started as a single moment of defiance in a history class had transformed into something much bigger than he could have imagined. The whispers that once mocked him now carried the sound of support. But with support came backlash. And the administration, it seemed, was not going to back down without a fight. It was the next day when things started to escalate. Jamal was sitting in the library, doing his homework with Shadow lying at his feet, when he noticed a few students gathering around, talking in hushed voices. The usual hum of the room felt different. There was an undercurrent of tension in the air, and Jamal could feel it pulling at him. "Hey, Jamal, you got a minute?" Sarah's voice broke through his thoughts. He looked up, surprised to see her standing there, a concerned look on her face. "Yeah, what's up?" Jamal asked, pushing his books aside as he looked at her. "I just wanted to tell you something," Sarah said, her voice low. "I overheard something today, about a meeting with the principal. They're going to talk about, well, about you and Shadow. They're not happy about it, Jamal." Jamal's heart skipped a beat. "What? But I thought things were going okay." "They are, kind of," Sarah said. "But the administration doesn't like the way things are going. They're planning to have a formal meeting about whether or not they'll let Shadow stay in the classroom. And I heard that a few teachers are pushing for a ban. Mr. Green, especially." Jamal's stomach tightened. He had known this day would come, but hearing it made it all feel real. The ground beneath his feet felt like it was shifting, and it wasn't in his favor. Why would Mr. Green push for a ban? Jamal asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought he was just annoyed, not this." "I don't know," Sarah replied, looking uncomfortable. "But he's one of the ones who thinks the dog is a distraction. I think he's worried about other students being distracted, too. Some of the teachers are on his side. It's starting to feel like there's this divide, you know." Jamal nodded, feeling the weight of her words settle heavily in his chest. He could feel the tension rising, the fight that was about to unfold. He couldn't help but wonder how far it would go. And what if it wasn't enough? "Thanks for telling me, Sarah," Jamal said quietly, feeling a sudden rush of gratitude. "I don't know what I'd do without people like you." She smiled weakly, giving his shoulder a brief pat. "You're not alone in this, Jamal. You've got us. And we're not backing down either." But even as Sarah left the library, her words offering comfort, Jamal couldn't ignore the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. The thought of facing the principal, Mr. Green, and the rest of the administration made his head spin. Would they listen to him? Or would they shut him down entirely? The meeting was scheduled for the next day, and as the bell rang, signaling the end of school, Jamal couldn't shake the thought of it. He gathered his things slowly, Shadow by his side, the dog sensing his unease as they walked out of the building together. Jamal's mind was spinning with what-ifs. What if they told him Shadow couldn't stay? What if they insisted he leave the school? He had no idea what he would do. He couldn't imagine school without Shadow. He had become his anchor, his lifeline. To lose him would be more than he could bear. The next morning, Jamal arrived at school early. He wanted to make sure he had time to gather his thoughts before the meeting. As he walked down the hallway, he could feel the eyes on him again, the stares from students who were either still skeptical or completely opposed to the idea of a dog in the classroom. But today, it didn't matter. Jamal was determined to stay calm. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was bigger than that. The meeting was held in the principal's office, and as Jamal walked in with Shadow at his side, he saw several familiar faces, Mr. Green, Mrs. Harris, the school counselor, and, of course, Principal Mitchell. Jamal took a deep breath as he sat down, his hands gripping the edge of his chair. Principal Mitchell was the first to speak. "Jamal, thank you for joining us today," she said, her voice polite but firm. "We've called this meeting to discuss the situation with your service dog, Shadow. We've received numerous complaints, and we need to find a resolution." Jamal's heart pounded in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I understand. But I'm not here to argue. I just need you all to understand why I need Shadow here." Mr. Green was the next to speak. "Jamal, I've told you before. This dog is a distraction. We've had complaints from students who find it difficult to concentrate. Others are concerned about allergies, and some simply feel uncomfortable with the dog's presence. We've made exceptions for you, but we can't continue like this. You need to understand that this is disrupting the learning environment for everyone." Jamal felt the weight of his words sinking in. He could see Mr. Green's frustration, but he wasn't going to back down. "I get it, Mr. Green," Jamal said. But it's not just a dog. Shadow helps me focus. Without him, I can't concentrate. I can't do my work, I can't participate in class. It's not just about me having a pet. He's a service dog, and he's helping me with my anxiety. Mrs. Harris, the school counselor, leaned forward slightly. I believe Jamal is trying to communicate something very important here. We've seen his progress with Shadow in the classroom. It's clear that the presence of the dog is providing him with a sense of security that is helping him perform better academically. While I understand the concerns about allergies and distractions, we need to look at the bigger picture. Jamal's well-being is at stake here. But Principal Mitchell wasn't so easily swayed. She looked at Jamal, her expression thoughtful but stern. We have to balance the needs of all students. If we make an exception for you, what message does that send to the other students? We can't allow one person's needs to disrupt the learning experience for everyone else. The conversation spiraled into a back and forth, with Jamal trying to explain the importance of Shadow's presence while the administration pushed back. The more he tried to speak, the more frustrated he became, as if the words couldn't reach them. But through the tension, he noticed something. The faces of some of the other students, the ones who had supported him in the past, were now filled with determination. They weren't in the room, but Jamal could feel their presence. Their support was unwavering, and that kept him going. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Principal Mitchell spoke again. We will take everything into consideration, she said. We will also be seeking input from other students and teachers. You'll be informed of our decision soon. Jamal left the meeting feeling drained, but with a small flicker of hope. The decision wasn't final. But one thing was clear, this was only the beginning. The days following the meeting were some of the longest Jamal had ever experienced. He couldn't focus on his classes, his thoughts always drifting back to the decision that was looming over him. The administration had said they would take everything into consideration, but Jamal knew the reality. They were already leaning toward a decision, one that might not be in his favor. He kept his head down, working in the classroom as best as he could, trying to ignore the looks and whispers. His classmates were still supportive, but even their words couldn't quell the anxiety gnawing at him. He had no control over what was happening. No matter how many people supported him, no matter how many times he stood up for himself, the decision was out of his hands. Every morning, as Jamal walked into school with Shadow at his side, he felt the tension in the air. It was as if the entire school was waiting for something to break, waiting for the decision to come down, for the conclusion to the story that had been unfolding for weeks. The stares of his peers had changed, though. They were no longer filled with judgment, but curiosity. Some looked at him with concern, others with admiration. He felt a weight of expectation on his shoulders. On the third day after the meeting, Jamal received an unexpected message. It was from Sarah. Hey, Jamal. I think you should meet me in the library during lunch today. I overheard something, and I think it's important. Jamal's stomach churned at the cryptic message. What could this be about? Was it more bad news? But he knew he couldn't avoid it. Not now. He had to know what was happening, even if it meant facing more bad news. At lunch, he made his way to the library, Shadow following closely behind, his calm presence grounding Jamal as he walked. When he entered the library, Sarah was sitting at one of the tables, her expression tense. Sarah? Jamal asked, his voice low as he approached. What's going on? Sarah looked up at him, her eyes wide with concern. You need to know what I heard. They've made a decision. Jamal felt his heart race. What? What decision? Principal Mitchell, Mr. Green, and a few other teachers, some of the ones who've been pushing for Shadow to be banned, have decided to issue a formal policy change, Sarah said quietly. They've decided that Shadow can't be in the classroom anymore. The words hit Jamal like a punch to the gut. His entire body went numb, and for a moment, he couldn't think. He just stared at Sarah, trying to process what she was saying. Wait, what? Jamal choked out. No. This can't be happening. I'm sorry, Jamal, Sarah said, her voice full of regret. I overheard Mrs. Harris talking to Mr. Green. They said it's already been finalized. Shadow is no longer allowed in class, starting tomorrow. Jamal felt the floor shift beneath him. His mind was reeling. He thought he had been doing everything right, standing up for himself, finding support, showing that Shadow was not just a dog, but a necessity for his mental health. How could this happen? How could they take him away from him now? I don't know what to do, Jamal muttered, his voice breaking. Shadow, sensing his distress, padded over to him and nudged his hand with his nose, offering the comfort he always did in these moments of uncertainty. Sarah reached out and placed a hand on his shoulder. You have to fight this, Jamal. I know it's hard, but you can't let them win. You've already come this far. Jamal took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He knew Sarah was right. This wasn't just about losing Shadow, it was about losing his voice, his right to be heard, his right to feel safe in a place that should be a refuge for learning. He couldn't let this happen. Not after everything he'd already fought for. I'll fight, he said, the words coming out with a strength he hadn't expected. I'm not backing down. I won't let them take him away. That afternoon, Jamal made a decision. He wasn't going to just accept the school's decision. He would take a stand, not just for himself, but for anyone who had ever been told they didn't belong, for anyone who had been overlooked or dismissed because their needs didn't fit into someone else's idea of what was normal. Jamal knew it wouldn't be easy. The administration had already made their stance clear. But he had a new determination, he wasn't going to sit quietly this time. If he had to go to the school board, if he had to speak to anyone who would listen, he would. He would fight for Shadow, for his own rights, and for the right of every student who felt unseen and unheard. The following morning, Jamal stood at the front of the classroom, his hands clasped tightly around the straps of his backpack. His heart was pounding in his chest as he prepared for what would likely be the hardest day yet. As he entered the building, he felt the familiar eyes on him again. Some of his classmates looked sympathetic, others seemed wary, and still others looked at him with a quiet form of respect. Jamal took a deep breath and walked toward his first class. But today was different. He could feel it in the air, the tension, the uncertainty, the weight of the decision looming just over the horizon. As he entered the classroom, he was met by the stern gaze of Mr. Green, who was already standing near the door. Jamal, Mr. Green said quietly, his voice lacking the usual hostility. I need to speak with you for a moment. Jamal's stomach tightened, but he nodded. Sure, Mr. Green. They stepped out into the hallway, away from the prying eyes of his classmates. Jamal, Mr. Green began, I want to be clear about something. The decision has been made. Shadow is not allowed in the classroom anymore. Jamal felt his pulse quicken. You can't just. I'm sorry, but this is final, Mr. Green interrupted. We've made every accommodation we can, but it's disruptive. The policy is clear, and the administration has decided to enforce it. I've done everything I could, but this isn't up to me anymore. Jamal's anger flared, but he fought to keep his voice steady. This isn't just about a dog, Mr. Green. This is about my ability to learn, my ability to be in school without feeling like I'm going to lose control every time I walk into a classroom. Shadow is my support, and you can't just take that away from me. I understand that, Jamal, Mr. Green said, his voice softer now. But this is the decision that's been made. I don't like it either, but I don't have a choice. Jamal's mind was racing. He couldn't just let it end here. He would find a way. But as he stood there, facing Mr. Green, he realized that there was no easy solution. No matter how many people were supporting him, the administration had made their decision, and it was one that seemed impossible to undo. But Jamal wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. The days after his conversation with Mr. Green felt like a blur of emotions. Jamal had never felt so small and so powerful at the same time. The crushing weight of the decision loomed over him, but beneath it was a spark, an undeniable urge to not back down. He wasn't just fighting for Shadow anymore. He was fighting for his right to feel safe, to exist fully in a place that had always been a struggle for him. He had to stand strong, no matter the odds. The next morning, as Jamal entered the school, he walked with purpose. Shadow was by his side, as always, sensing the shift in his owner's demeanor. Jamal felt the stares and whispers from his classmates, some sympathetic, others unsure, but he ignored them. They didn't know what he was about to do, and he didn't plan to tell them yet. He had a plan, and it was time to put it into motion. He had spoken to Sarah the night before. She was one of the first people he'd reached out to after the conversation with Mr. Green. Sarah had been incredibly supportive throughout this entire ordeal, but now it was time to take things further. They needed to rally the students, make sure the school knew they weren't alone. This fight was bigger than just one person. As Jamal sat down in his first class of the day, he could already feel the tension building. Mr. Green was nowhere to be found, which meant the decision had officially been enforced. Shadow couldn't stay in class anymore. But Jamal wasn't going to let that happen. Not without a fight. When the bell rang for lunch, Jamal met up with Sarah in the courtyard. They found a quiet spot near the back of the school, away from the prying eyes of the administration. "I've been thinking about what we can do," Jamal said, his voice steady but intense. "I know this is going to be hard, but we need to get as many people on our side as possible. We can't let this decision stand." Sarah nodded, her expression determined. "I agree. I've already spoken to a few people in class, and they're with you. They're upset about what's happening. But we need to make it official. We need to get a petition going. If we can gather enough signatures, maybe the school will listen." "That's a good idea," Jamal said, his mind racing with possibilities. "But we need more than just a petition. We need to show the school that this isn't just a one-person issue. We need to remind them of the people who support us, the people who understand why Shadow is so important to me. It's not just about me, it's about anyone who's ever been told they don't belong or that their needs don't matter." "Exactly," Sarah agreed. "We'll show them that we're not backing down. We'll get the community involved. Parents, teachers, other students, they all need to know what's going on." By the time the bell rang to signal the end of lunch, Jamal and Sarah had a plan. They would start with a petition, reaching out to students in the hallways, during classes, and on social media. They would talk to teachers who had been supportive of Jamal and Shadow and ask them to stand by him publicly. Jamal would also contact his parents, explaining what had happened and how they could help. This wasn't just about Shadow being in school, it was about his right to an education and the support he needed to succeed. Jamal knew it wouldn't be easy. The administration was powerful, and they had already made their decision. But he couldn't back down. He couldn't let Shadow be taken away from him. Not after everything they had been through together. That afternoon, as Jamal sat in his last class of the day, he felt a flicker of hope. He wasn't alone. As the students filed into the classroom, some of them gave him small, supportive nods. Some whispered to one another, casting glances at Jamal. He couldn't hear what they were saying, but it didn't matter. He could feel it. The support was there. The bell rang, and Jamal stood up, Shadow at his side. He walked toward the door, his heart pounding with a new sense of purpose. When he stepped out into the hallway, he was greeted by Sarah and a few other students, who had come to offer their support. They were ready. They were going to fight for him. After school, Jamal and Sarah sat down to draft the petition. They made sure it included clear, strong points, why Shadow was necessary for Jamal's well-being, how his presence in the classroom helped him focus and succeed, and how the decision to ban him was a violation of Jamal's rights as a student. They included a section for students, teachers, and parents to sign their names in support. By the end of the week, they had gathered hundreds of signatures. The petition spread quickly through the school, with many students expressing their support for Jamal and Shadow. Even some of the teachers who had been on the fence about the situation began to speak out, sharing how they had seen the positive impact Shadow had on Jamal's ability to learn and engage in class. But not everyone was happy about the petition. The administration caught wind of it quickly, and Jamal could feel the pressure mounting. He was summoned to Principal Mitchell's office the following Monday, where she sat behind her desk, a stern look on her face. "Jamal, I'm sure you're aware of the petition circulating around the school," Principal Mitchell began. "We've been receiving complaints from staff and parents about this situation. You're creating a disturbance." "I'm not trying to create a disturbance, Principal Mitchell," Jamal replied, his voice steady but full of conviction. "I'm trying to make sure I have what I need to succeed. Shadow helps me focus. He's not a distraction. And I'm not the only one who feels this way. The petition shows that." Principal Mitchell's face softened, but her tone remained firm. "I understand that this is important to you, Jamal. But the decision has been made. Shadow cannot be in the classroom. The policies are clear, and we have to follow them." "But you don't understand," Jamal said, his voice rising slightly. "This isn't just about a dog. It's about my education. It's about me being able to learn and feel safe in a place where I've always struggled. You can't just take that away from me." The words hung in the air, and for a brief moment, Jamal thought he saw a flicker of hesitation in Principal Mitchell's eyes. But she quickly masked it, leaning back in her chair. "I understand your concerns, Jamal," she said, her voice calm. "But I think this is a matter of policy and what's best for the entire student body. We've made the decision." Jamal stood up, his mind racing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. He wasn't going to give up without a fight. The next few days felt like a whirlwind for Jamal. The pressure was mounting, and with each passing hour, it seemed like the walls were closing in. Principal Mitchell had made it clear that the decision about Shadow wasn't going to be reversed. Despite the overwhelming support from students, teachers, and even some parents, the school's stance remained firm. But Jamal wasn't about to let it end there. He knew there had to be another way, another path forward, no matter how difficult it might be. He woke up that Thursday morning, the weight of his fight heavier than ever. Shadow, who had been a comforting presence through all of this, sat by his bed, looking up at him with those warm, knowing eyes. Jamal gently petted his dog's head, the familiar motion offering a small sliver of comfort. They were a team. And no matter how hard the fight got, Jamal knew he couldn't back down now. He had come too far. By the time he reached school, Jamal's mind was racing with thoughts of what to do next. He couldn't just keep fighting the school on his own, it was clear that they weren't going to budge. But he also couldn't let this issue disappear into the background, where it would be forgotten. The voices of those who supported him, who believed in his right to have Shadow by his side, needed to be heard, loud and clear. That afternoon, he sat down with Sarah in the library, their usual spot for planning. The excitement from the growing support had shifted into an undercurrent of urgency. Sarah, as always, was by his side, ready to help Jamal in whatever way she could. But even she could sense that the next step was going to be far more complicated. "Jamal, we've got a lot of signatures," Sarah said, glancing at the petition sheet they'd printed out. "We've got the student body, a bunch of teachers, and even some parents who've come forward. It's clear that there's a lot of support for you." "I know," Jamal replied, his voice steady but tinged with frustration. "But the school isn't listening. They've already made their decision, and I don't think they're going to change their minds just because of a petition." Sarah nodded in agreement. "You're right. They've been pretty adamant about it. But maybe it's time to take it outside the school. We need to go bigger. We need to make them understand that this isn't just about you, it's about every student who needs support to thrive." Jamal sat back in his chair, his mind swirling with the thought. You're right. This isn't just about Shadow. This is about my right to an education, my right to be safe here. But how do we take it outside the school? What can we do that'll make them pay attention? Sarah leaned forward, her eyes bright with determination. What about legal action? There are laws about discrimination, accommodations for students with disabilities, and the right to support animals in schools. If they're not providing the support you need, maybe there's something bigger at play here. Jamal's heart skipped a beat. Legal action. It sounded like a huge step, but Sarah was right, this was bigger than just a school policy. If he could find a lawyer willing to help, he might have a real chance of forcing the school to reconsider. I don't know where to start, Jamal said, his voice unsure. This feels so overwhelming. I know it's a lot, Sarah said softly. But you're not in this alone. We've got the petition, we've got the support, and now we just need the right legal help. I'll help you research it. Let's start by finding a lawyer who's dealt with this kind of stuff before. Jamal stared down at the petition, the names of all the people who believed in him and Shadow. It was more than just a collection of signatures, it was a statement. It was proof that he wasn't just a lone student trying to get his dog into school. He was part of something much bigger. This was about challenging a system that didn't always work for everyone. This was about making sure that students who needed support had access to it, no matter what. Okay, Jamal said, his voice firm. Let's do it. Let's find a lawyer. The next day, Sarah and Jamal dove into their research. They spent hours online, looking up legal cases involving service animals in schools, ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, violations, and students' rights to have emotional support animals in educational environments. The more they learned, the more Jamal realized that he might actually have a case. There were laws in place that protected students like him, students who needed emotional support animals to succeed academically. By the end of the day, Sarah had found a lawyer who specialized in education law and civil rights. His name was Mr. Thomas Blackwell, and his practice focused on representing students with disabilities in disputes with schools. He had experience with cases involving service animals and emotional support animals, and he had a reputation for standing up to school administrations. Jamal and Sarah contacted him the next morning, explaining the situation in as much detail as they could. Mr. Blackwell agreed to meet with them the following afternoon, and Jamal felt a new sense of hope growing inside of him. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he might actually be able to do something about this. That afternoon, they sat in the small office of Mr. Blackwell, who greeted them with a firm handshake. He was an older man, with graying hair and sharp eyes that made Jamal feel like he was being taken seriously for the first time since this whole ordeal had started. Jamal, I've read through your case, Mr. Blackwell began. And I can tell you this, you have a right to have your emotional support animal with you. The law is clear about this, especially when it comes to students with documented mental health needs. Jamal's heart soared. So, you think we can actually win this? I think we have a strong case, Mr. Blackwell said, leaning forward. The school may have their policies, but they can't override your rights as a student with a disability. If they're refusing you the accommodations you need, they could be in violation of the law. We'll have to challenge them on this, but it's a fight worth having. Jamal felt a rush of relief wash over him. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. He was fighting for anyone who had ever been told that their needs didn't matter. He was standing up for every student who had ever felt powerless, pushed aside, or ignored. Okay, Jamal said, his voice filled with determination. Let's do it. Let's take this all the way. By the end of the week, Jamal had a team of people behind him, Sarah, his parents, the lawyer, and the students who had signed the petition, all of them ready to stand with him. He wasn't sure how long this fight would last, but he knew one thing for certain, he wasn't going to give up. Not for himself, and certainly not for Shadow. As Jamal walked into school the following Monday, he could feel the weight of what was about to unfold. He wasn't just a student anymore, he was a force, a voice for the voiceless. He walked with his head held high, Shadow by his side, ready to take the next step in this fight. The school had no idea what was coming. Jamal's heart pounded as he sat in the car with his parents, headed toward the courthouse. It felt unreal, the weight of it all pressing down on him. He wasn't just a high school student anymore. He was part of a legal battle that had the potential to change his future, and he felt the gravity of that with every passing minute. Shadow, as always, sat in the back seat, his tail wagging gently as if to remind Jamal that no matter how big the fight was, they were in it together. "I know this is scary," his mom said softly, glancing at him through the rearview mirror. "But we're with you every step of the way." His dad, quiet but equally supportive, reached over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "You've already shown so much courage. We're proud of you for standing up for yourself and for others. This fight might not be easy, but we believe in you." Jamal nodded, trying to steady his nerves. The lawsuit they had filed against the school had caught the attention of the media, and what started as a small dispute was quickly becoming a public spectacle. There were news articles, interviews, and even social media discussions about his case. Some people were supportive, applauding him for standing up to the system. Others, however, were critical, questioning whether a dog had any place in a classroom. As they pulled into the parking lot, Jamal's nerves intensified. The courthouse loomed ahead, and for a brief moment, he hesitated. Could he really go through with this? The thought of facing the school administration in front of a judge, knowing the world would be watching, felt overwhelming. But then he looked down at Shadow, who was sitting at his feet, calm and steady. It was as if the dog understood the importance of the moment too. "I'm ready," Jamal said, more to himself than anyone else. He opened the door, and with a deep breath, he stepped out of the car. Inside the courthouse, Jamal felt the eyes of the crowd on him. The school district's representatives were seated on the other side of the courtroom, their expressions a mixture of professionalism and frustration. Jamal could see Principal Mitchell sitting with them, her arms crossed, her eyes cold and distant. She hadn't spoken to Jamal since the initial confrontation, but he could feel her presence, the symbol of the authority that was challenging him. Mr. Blackwell, the lawyer who had been guiding him through this journey, stood beside him. He was calm and collected, his sharp gaze scanning the room with confidence. He had been preparing for this moment for weeks, and he was ready to take on the school's legal team. "Jamal," Mr. Blackwell said quietly, leaning down to speak with him. "Remember, this is your case. It's about your rights as a student, your right to an education, and the support you need. Don't let their tactics intimidate you. Stay focused. You've got this." Jamal nodded, his hands gripping the edges of the bench as the judge entered the room. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jamal tried to calm his mind, but the weight of everything was impossible to ignore. He glanced back at his parents, who smiled reassuringly at him, giving him the strength to face the battle ahead. The judge called the court to order, and the proceedings began. For the next few hours, the legal arguments were presented, and Jamal felt as though the entire room was spinning around him. His lawyer presented evidence showing that Shadow was more than just a pet, it was an emotional support animal, legally recognized as necessary for Jamal's well-being. They discussed Jamal's documented mental health history and the ways that having Shadow in the classroom had helped him succeed. Expert witnesses were brought in to testify about the benefits of emotional support animals in schools, and Jamal could feel the momentum building in his favor. But as the school's lawyers presented their side, Jamal felt his stomach churn. They argued that the presence of an animal in the classroom was a distraction, that it disrupted the learning environment, and that other students had expressed concerns about Shadow's presence. Jamal's heart sank as he heard Principal Mitchell's voice on the stand, reiterating the school's stance. "The presence of a dog in the classroom violates school policies regarding allergies, health concerns, and the general safety of students," she said. Her voice was steady, but there was a hint of frustration in it. "We understand that Jamal may feel comforted by his dog, but it's important to remember that the policies in place are there for the well-being of all students. Jamal could feel the anger rising in him. He wasn't just fighting for his right to have Shadow in school. He was fighting for the right of every student who struggled with their mental health, for the kids who felt invisible in a system that wasn't built for them. This wasn't just about him. When it was finally Jamal's turn to testify, he stood up and walked to the witness stand. The eyes of the courtroom were on him, and the weight of the moment hit him harder than ever. But when he looked down at Shadow, sitting calmly beside his parents, he felt the strength to keep going. He cleared his throat and began. "Shadow helps me get through the day," Jamal said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Without him, it's hard for me to focus, to feel like I belong. He's not just a dog. He's the one who calms me down when I get overwhelmed. He's the reason I can stay in class and learn." Jamal paused for a moment, looking out at the judge and the gallery. "I know that some people think Shadow is a distraction. But to me, he's everything. He helps me be myself, to learn, to engage with the world. Without him, I don't know where I'd be. I don't think I'd be able to make it through the day." There was a silence in the room as Jamal's words hung in the air. He could feel the weight of his own truth. For a moment, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The hearing lasted several more hours, but Jamal's testimony had made an impact. His sincerity, his courage, it was clear that this was more than just a legal case. It was a fight for something much bigger. The judge called for a recess, giving everyone time to reflect and prepare for closing arguments. Jamal sat down beside his parents, who had been silent throughout his testimony, but their eyes were filled with pride. His mom reached out and squeezed his hand. "You did amazing, Jamal," she whispered. "I'm so proud of you." He smiled, feeling a small surge of warmth at her words. But there was still so much left to fight for. The outcome of this case would determine whether he could continue to bring Shadow to school, but more importantly, it would send a message about how schools treat students with special needs, students who require different kinds of support to succeed. When the judge returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. It was time for closing arguments. Jamal's heart raced as Mr. Blackwell stood up to present their final plea. "We are not here to disrupt the educational environment," Mr. Blackwell said, his voice firm and confident. "We are here because Jamal has a right to the support he needs. Shadow is not just a pet, Shadow is a part of Jamal's life and well-being. This case is about Jamal's rights as a student, his right to learn, to feel safe, and to have the necessary support to thrive. The school's decision to deny him that right is a violation of his civil rights." Jamal held his breath, waiting for the judge's decision. The room was still. Time seemed to stretch on forever. Would they win? Would the judge rule in his favor? Then, the judge spoke. The silence in the courtroom was deafening as the judge paused, weighing the moment before speaking. Jamal could feel every beat of his heart, his pulse thundering in his ears. He stared at the judge, hoping, praying for a ruling that would change his life. "The court has deliberated and reviewed the evidence presented," Judge Harrison's voice echoed through the room, steady and deliberate. Jamal held his breath. It is clear that Jamal has made a strong case regarding his need for an emotional support animal. The law protects students with disabilities, including those who require emotional support animals as part of their learning experience. Jamal's stomach twisted with anticipation. He squeezed his hands together, trying to keep calm. However, Judge Harrison continued, "The school has its own policies that must be followed for the safety and well-being of all students. The balance between accommodating a student's rights and maintaining a conducive learning environment is delicate." Jamal's heart sank for a moment. Was the judge about to side with the school? Had all his efforts been in vain? But, the judge added, his voice firm, "This case brings up important questions about what it means to support students with disabilities. The court is ordering that Jamal be granted permission to bring his emotional support animal, Shadow, into the school under the provisions of the Americans with Disabilities Act, effective immediately. However, we are also ordering that both the school and Jamal work together to ensure a suitable arrangement is made to accommodate Shadow without disrupting the learning environment. The words hit Jamal like a wave of relief. His knees went weak, and he felt his breath catch in his throat. Shadow was officially allowed to stay by his side at school. The room erupted in murmurs and whispers. Jamal looked around, seeing the surprise on the faces of the school's representatives, some of whom looked angry, while others were simply stunned. But Jamal didn't care about their reactions. He glanced at his parents, who were smiling, their eyes shining with tears of pride and joy. They were there, standing by him every step of the way, and they had all won. "You did it, Jamal," his mom whispered, tears filling her eyes. "You really did it." Jamal stood up, feeling the weight of his victory, but also the weight of everything that had led to this moment. He was not just fighting for himself anymore, he was fighting for every student who felt invisible, every person who had ever been told that their needs didn't matter. He had stood up, and now, he had a chance to make a real difference. But the victory was bittersweet. He knew this was just one battle in a much larger fight. The court had ruled in his favor, but the school had made it clear they weren't going to make things easy. They would still have to figure out the logistics of Shadow's presence in the classroom, and there would undoubtedly be more challenges ahead. As they left the courthouse, Jamal's mind was racing. He was finally allowed to have Shadow with him at school, but what would the next days, weeks, and months look like? Would the school try to make things difficult for him? Would the other students be supportive or resentful? The victory felt hard-earned, but Jamal knew that the real work was just beginning. The days after the court ruling were filled with a mixture of emotions. Jamal had hoped for an immediate, seamless transition, but reality quickly set in. While the ruling was a monumental victory, the school's administration made it clear that they were not fully on board. There were meetings, discussions, and policy changes to consider. The school had no clear precedent for this kind of case, and they had to create a plan that would allow Shadow to accompany Jamal without violating other students' rights or creating disruptions. At first, it seemed like the school was dragging their feet, finding loopholes to delay the implementation of the ruling. Jamal's heart sank at the thought that his hard-earned victory might be undermined by bureaucracy. Shadow was allowed in the building, but the specifics, where he would be allowed to go, how the classroom environment would be adjusted, were still up in the air. Jamal wasn't going to wait around for the school to make a decision. He had learned from this whole experience that change didn't come easily, and he was willing to fight for it. The school administrator suggested they hold a meeting to discuss a suitable arrangement. Jamal was invited to attend, and he knew this would be his chance to ensure that Shadow would be treated as more than just a special exception. This was about creating a system that allowed students who needed accommodations to get them without feeling like outcasts or burdens. When the meeting day arrived, Jamal sat in a conference room with his parents, Mr. Blackwell, and a few school representatives. Principal Mitchell was there too, though she avoided making eye contact with Jamal, her expression tight and unreadable. Mr. Blackwell began the meeting, addressing the school's concerns while firmly reiterating Jamal's rights. "We're here to ensure that the accommodations required by the law are respected and upheld. Jamal has the right to bring his emotional support animal to school, but it is also important to work together on creating a healthy environment for all students." As they moved through the discussions, Jamal couldn't help but notice the shift. At first, the school representatives seemed distant and dismissive. But as the conversation evolved, it became clear that they were beginning to understand the broader implications of the case. The realization was slow, but it was there. The school started making suggestions for how they could create a system that would allow Shadow to accompany Jamal without creating disruptions. They talked about designated spaces where Shadow could stay during certain classes, and even introduced the idea of creating a policy for other students who might need similar accommodations in the future. The school agreed to provide regular check-ins to ensure that Jamal's experience, and that of other students with disabilities, was being respected. Jamal couldn't help but feel a surge of pride as he realized the conversation was no longer just about him. It was about creating lasting change, not just for him, but for others who needed support. He had made a difference, and it was beginning to show. A week later, Jamal walked into his first class of the new semester. Shadow was by his side, as usual, calm and steady, ready for the day ahead. The atmosphere in the classroom was different. There was a sense of understanding, a feeling that change was possible. Jamal could sense the students' curiosity but also their acceptance. It wasn't just Jamal who had been affected by this case, it was the entire school community. By the end of the day, Jamal realized something important. His victory had not been about getting Shadow into school. It had been about proving that people like him mattered. That their struggles were valid. That their needs should be met, not ignored. As Jamal and Shadow walked down the hallway together, side by side, Jamal felt a deep sense of peace. This wasn't just about one student and one dog. This was about creating a world where every person could feel supported, where no one had to face the world alone. The road had been long, but this was just the beginning. And Jamal was ready to continue the journey. Jamal sat on the porch at home, Shadow by his side, looking out at the neighborhood. The sun was setting, casting a warm golden light across the street, and for the first time in a long while, Jamal felt at peace. The last few months had been a whirlwind of courtrooms, meetings, and media attention, but as he sat in the quiet of his own yard, he couldn't help but reflect on how far he had come. It wasn't just about the legal victory anymore. It wasn't even just about Shadow being allowed to stay by his side in school. What mattered more was the message they had sent. The conversation they had started about the rights of students with disabilities, about mental health, and about how schools could support their students. Jamal thought back to that first day when he had walked into the principal's office, feeling like his world was falling apart. He never could have imagined how his simple request for his dog to stay with him would snowball into something that would impact so many lives. But the fight had given him a voice that he had never fully realized he had. And now, he had a platform. The case had made headlines, and Jamal found himself speaking at school assemblies, talking about mental health awareness, and advocating for accommodations for students who struggled like he did. He had become an unexpected leader, not just for students with emotional support animals, but for anyone who needed help navigating an educational system that wasn't always designed to meet their needs. The changes in the school system were slow but steady. Principal Mitchell, while initially resistant, had agreed to meet with Jamal and his family regularly to ensure that Shadow's presence didn't cause disruptions. The school began to take a more proactive stance, offering counseling services and support for students who had emotional or psychological challenges. Jamal's victory had sparked a change in the way the school viewed students like him, students who didn't fit into the typical mold but still deserved an education. One of the most significant changes was the introduction of an emotional support animal policy at the school. Jamal had worked alongside teachers, administrators, and mental health professionals to craft a plan that would allow students with emotional or psychological needs to bring their support animals to school, as long as they met certain criteria. It wasn't just about making allowances for students like him, it was about breaking down the stigma around mental health and ensuring that every student had the tools they needed to succeed. Jamal's own teachers, who had initially been hesitant about Shadow's presence in the classroom, were now some of the loudest advocates for the policy. They had seen firsthand how Shadow helped Jamal stay focused, calmed his anxiety, and allowed him to engage with the material in a way he never had before. Some teachers even began to explore similar accommodations for their other students who had needs but didn't know how to ask for help. The change wasn't just at Jamal's school. The story of his legal battle spread across the district, and soon other schools began to look at their own policies regarding emotional support animals. Some schools were inspired to take similar steps toward creating inclusive environments where all students, regardless of their challenges, had a chance to succeed. But Jamal knew the work wasn't done yet. There were still so many students who felt like they didn't belong, like they didn't have a voice. He thought about his friends, his classmates. Many of them were still struggling in silence. Jamal knew he couldn't stop here. His journey had opened his eyes to the bigger picture, the need for systemic change, not just in one school, but in schools everywhere. The battle he had fought for himself was only one small part of a much larger fight for fairness, inclusion, and empathy. A few weeks after the policy was finalized, Jamal was invited to speak at a district-wide meeting with other students, teachers, and administrators. The topic was how schools could better support students with mental health challenges, and Jamal's story was a central part of the discussion. As he stood in front of a room full of people, some of them nervous, some of them hopeful, Jamal took a deep breath and began. "When I first brought Shadow to school, I never imagined that it would lead to all of this," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "All I wanted was to feel like I belonged, to be able to go to school without feeling like I was struggling alone. But what I learned through this whole process is that there are so many other students who feel the same way, who are struggling silently. I realized that my fight wasn't just about getting my dog into school, it was about making sure every student has the chance to succeed, no matter what they're going through." He paused, letting his words sink in. "Shadow is more than just a dog to me. He's my support, my reminder that I can make it through the day. But there are a lot of students who don't have that kind of support. We need to create a system where every student feels seen, heard, and supported. Where no one has to fight alone." The room was silent for a moment, but then there was a ripple of applause. Jamal felt a rush of pride wash over him. He had come so far, from being the quiet, anxious student who didn't know how to ask for help, to becoming a speaker, an advocate, and a symbol of change. It was overwhelming in the best possible way. That evening, as Jamal and Shadow took a walk around the neighborhood, Jamal reflected on how much his life had changed. He was no longer the kid who felt out of place at school. He was the kid who had made his voice heard, and who had changed the system in the process. "I never imagined it would be like this," Jamal said aloud, his voice a mix of disbelief and gratitude. "I didn't know how much this fight would mean to others." Shadow, as always, trotted alongside him, his tail wagging gently. Jamal couldn't help but smile as he looked down at the dog that had been with him through it all. The world felt different now. He felt different. He had made a difference, not just for himself but for everyone who had ever felt overlooked or unheard. Jamal's victory wasn't just about him getting to keep his dog in class, it was about the power of speaking up, of standing firm in your truth, even when the world tells you it's not possible. As Jamal's senior year continued, he found himself becoming more involved in advocating for students' rights, working with school officials and community organizations to ensure that students with disabilities had the support they needed. His story had inspired others, and Jamal was determined to keep pushing for change. He had always known that the road wouldn't be easy, but now he understood that the fight was never about winning, it was about creating a legacy of compassion and understanding that would continue long after the courtroom drama was over. Jamal had started this journey feeling small and powerless, but now, as he looked toward his future, he realized something important. He was no longer just a student with a disability. He was a leader, a change-maker. And with Shadow by his side, there was no limit to what he could accomplish. Together, they had rewritten the rules. And this was just the beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?